The temperature in the storage vault hovers at exactly 18 degrees Celsius, controlled, precise, the kind of environment where ancient things might speak, if you know how to listen. In the British Museum's Department of the Middle East, catalogue number 1891,509.2553 sits in a climate-controlled drawer. The object itself measures barely 4 centimetres in height, green stone, serpentine to be precise, carved with an intricacy that seems impossible for something created over 4,000 years ago. This is the Seal of Adda, and what it depicts should not exist. On its surface, rendered in reverse, so that when rolled across wet clay it would leave a positive impression, several figures stand in careful arrangement. On the left, a god with rays emanating from his shoulders rises between two mountains, the sun god Shamash, emerging at dawn. To his right stands another deity. Streams of water flow from his shoulders, fish swimming in the currents. This is Enki, god of wisdom and the subterranean waters. The carving shows the water as literal flowing streams, not symbolic suggestions. Between them are the divine figures, each with attributes so specific, so detailed, that scholars can identify them by their iconography alone. But here's what makes this small stone cylinder extraordinary. It was carved during the Akkadian period, roughly 2300 BCE. The artist who created it possessed knowledge of perspective, proportion, and symbolic language that suggests a sophisticated understanding not just of art, but of what was being depicted. These aren't crude representations, they're portraits. The seal shows gods interacting in a scene, not distant, not abstract, present, and it's not alone. Across museums in London, Paris, Berlin, Baghdad and Philadelphia, similar artefacts wait in similar vaults, cylinder seals showing divine figures standing beside humans, stone reliefs depicting gods participating in battles, statues inscribed with accounts of dreams where architectural plans were delivered by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, clay tablets recording conversations, instructions, genealogies of these figures spanning thousands of years. Two types of evidence, visual and textual, art and writing, and they tell the same story. The question isn't whether the Sumerians believed in the Anunnaki. We know they did. Every text confirms it. The question is something else entirely, something that archaeologists discuss in careful language, hedged with academic qualifications, something that makes conventional timelines uncomfortable. What if the Sumerians weren't creating mythology? What if they were keeping records? Before you dismiss that question, and many do, consider what you're about to see. Not theories, not speculation, evidence, physical artifacts you can examine yourself if you travel to these museums. Translations from actual clay tablets, with catalogue numbers, excavation details, and scholarly citations. Images carved in stone 4 millennia ago, showing scenes that, if we take them at face value, suggest something our current historical framework struggles to accommodate. This isn't about aliens. This isn't about conspiracy theories or ancient astronauts. This is about reading what the Sumerians actually wrote, looking at what they actually carved, and asking a simple question: why does their art depict exactly what their texts describe? Why is there such extraordinary consistency between the visual record and the written record when it comes to beings they insisted were real, were present, and were the source of their civilization? We're going to examine specific artifacts tonight, real objects. We'll look at the Walker vase, one of the earliest examples of narrative art ever created, showing a procession leading to a divine figure. We'll study cylinder seals that functioned as ancient identification, personal signatures rolled across contracts and letters, depicting their owners in the presence of gods. We'll read from the Atrahasis epic, where the creation of humanity is described in procedural detail. We'll analyse the Stele of the Vultures, where divine figures don't observe warfare, they participate in it. Each piece of evidence will include its museum location, its catalogue number, its excavation history. Each translation will note the original Sumerian or Akkadian terms. We're not asking you to believe anything, we're asking you to look, because somewhere between dismissing ancient texts as pure fantasy and accepting modern interpretations without question, there's a middle ground. A space where we can examine what the Sumerians actually said, what they actually showed, and why the two records, visual and textual, align so precisely. The Sila Vada shows gods with specific attributes doing specific things. The cuneiform tablets describe gods with those same attributes doing those same things. That's not mythology evolving randomly, that's documentation. Tonight we're going to trace that documentation, not to prove a conclusion, but to present evidence that mainstream archaeology acknowledges exists, but interprets through a very particular lens. We'll present that lens too, fairly. Then we'll examine whether it answers all the questions, or whether some mysteries remain. If you're listening from somewhere quiet, a bedroom in Manchester, an apartment in Toronto, a night shift in Seoul, take a moment to comment where you're watching from. This journey works better when we know we're not alone in asking these questions, when we know others are looking at the same evidence, weighing the same possibilities. The investigation begins with understanding who the Sumerians were, how we discovered them, and how we learnt to read their language. Because before we can ask what they recorded, we need to understand how we know what they recorded at all. The story starts in a place that no longer exists, a civilization that was lost for millennia, and a language that died, was forgotten, and then, impossibly, was remembered again, when heaven met earth. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates flow south from the mountains of Anatolia, carrying snowmelt and silt through what is now modern Iraq, eventually emptying into the Persian Gulf. 5,000 years ago, this delta region looked different. The coastline was further north, the marshlands were more extensive, and in this fertile crescent, something unprecedented happened. Civilization began, not slowly, not gradually building over tens of thousands of years. The archaeological record shows something different. Around 3500 BC, in the space of a few centuries, we see the appearance of cities. Not villages that grew into towns that became cities. Cities. Uruk covered 250 hectares at its peak. It had monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, administrative centres, workshops for specialised crafts, and most significantly, it had writing. The mainstream explanation attributes this rapid development to agricultural surplus, allowing population concentration and labour specialisation. The Sumerians, as we call these people, invented irrigation techniques that made the arid plains bloom. Surplus grain meant not everyone needed to farm. Some could become artisans, others could become priests. A few became administrators, keeping track of the grain in storehouses, the livestock in pens, the workers in fields. And to keep track, they needed records. So they invented writing. This is the conventional narrative, and the evidence supports it, to a point. We do see administrative tablets from Uruk recording grain allotments, livestock counts, and labour assignments. The earliest texts are indeed bureaucratic, mundane, lists, but the Sumerians themselves told a different story. In their own accounts, found on later tablets but referring to earlier times, they described their civilization as a gift, not something invented through trial and error over generations, but something bestowed. They had a word for this concept, me, may. The me were divine principles, the fundamental elements of civilization, not abstract concepts, specific things. Writing was a me, architecture was a me, kingship was a me, metalworking, music, leather tanning, pottery, all me. And according to Sumerian texts, the me came from the gods, specifically from Enki, the god of wisdom, who possessed them and at various times transferred them to humanity. Now, mainstream scholarship interprets this as myth explaining cultural development, a primitive people trying to make sense of their own advancement by attributing it to divine sources. This interpretation is reasonable and fits the evolutionary model of human progress we've constructed over the past century and a half. But let's sit with what the Sumerians actually recorded before we interpret it. They didn't say we gradually developed civilization. They said we received it. They didn't say our ancestors slowly learned agriculture. They said Enki taught the first king, Alulim, how to cultivate the land. They didn't describe a process of cultural evolution. They described an event of cultural transfer. The question, and it's a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, is why? Why would a civilization describe itself this way if the reality was gradual development? Why create a narrative of sudden instruction when their actual experience would have been slow accumulation of knowledge? One answer, because that's what makes for good origin stories. Every culture mythologizes its past, creates founder figures, explains the present through legendary events. Another answer, because that's what they remembered, or more precisely what they inherited from earlier generations who claim to remember. We can't know which answer is correct from the texts alone, but we can note what the texts consistently maintain across thousands of years of writing. The Anunnaki, literally those who from heaven to earth came, were described as the source, not symbolic source, actual source. Present beings who established cities, taught agriculture, instituted kingship, gave the me. Let's establish the basic timeline as archaeology has reconstructed it, because this matters for everything that follows. The Ubaid period, 6500 to 3800 BC, shows settled agricultural communities, but no cities, no writing, basic pottery and tools. The Uruk period, 4000 to 3100 BC, shows sudden urbanization. Monumental architecture appears. The first ziggurats are built. Complex administrative systems emerge. And in the final centuries of this period, cuneiform writing is invented. The early dynastic period, 2900 to 2334 BCE, sees Sumerian civilization reach its height. Multiple city-states, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, compete and cooperate. This is when most of the artifacts we'll examine were created. This is when the visual record becomes rich. The Akkadian period, 2334 to 2154 BCE, when a Semitic-speaking people conquered the Sumerian city-states and created the first empire. The Seal of Ada dates to this era. Akkadian becomes the language of administration, but Sumerian remains the language of scholarship and religion. Then waves of invasions, the rise and fall of dynasties, the Neo-Sumerian period, the Old Babylonian period, and eventually the absorption of Sumerian culture into broader Mesopotamian civilization. By 1800 BC, Sumerian was a dead language, preserved only by scribes in temples, copied and studied like Latin in medieval monasteries. But here's the crucial point. Throughout all these periods, the stories remained consistent. Different dynasties, different languages, different political situations, but the accounts of the Anunnaki, their role in founding civilization, their presence in the early days, stayed the same. The names of the gods didn't change. Their attributes didn't change. Their genealogies were preserved. This consistency is worth noting because mythology typically evolves. Gods merge, change names, acquire new attributes, lose old ones. But the Anunnaki of the early dynastic period are recognizably the same as the Anunnaki described in Old Babylonian texts 1,000 years later. Same names, same roles, same family relationships. Either this represents an extraordinarily conservative religious tradition maintaining doctrinal purity for millennia, certainly possible, or it represents the preservation of information considered historical. The Sumerians made a distinction, by the way. They had words for different types of past. Udul-li meant days of old, referring to the recent past within living memory. Udre meant ancient days, the deeper past preserved in tradition. And Udnam-lululu meant the days when mankind first appeared, the time of origins. When they wrote about the Anunnaki, they used that third category, the time of first things, and they wrote about it not as legend, but as genealogy, as chronology, as history. We began rediscovering this civilization in the mid-19th century. British and French archaeologists, driven partly by desire to verify biblical accounts, partly by colonial acquisition of antiquities, began excavating tells, artificial mounds, created by millennia of mud brick architecture, collapsing and being built upon again throughout Mesopotamia. Paul Marl-Botter excavated Nineveh in the 1840s. Austin Henry Layard worked at Nimrud and Nineveh shortly after. These early excavations focused on Assyrian sites, the more recent Mesopotamian civilization mentioned in the Bible. They found enormous palace complexes, massive stone reliefs of winged bulls and bearded kings, and most importantly, libraries, rooms filled with clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform, the oldest known writing system in the world. The breakthrough in decipherment came through the Behistun inscription, a massive rock carving in Iran containing the same text in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer and scholar, spent years copying the inscription by hanging from ropes on the cliff face, risking death for each character. His work, combined with other scholars like Edward Hincks and Julius Oppert, eventually cracked the code. By the 1850s, Akkadian could be read, and as more tablets were excavated and translated, scholars discovered something unexpected. Akkadian texts sometimes included glosses, explanations in another language, an older language, Sumerian. The discovery of the Sumerians shocked the academic world. Here was a civilization older than Babylon, older than Assyria, older than anything mentioned in the Bible. A people who had invented writing, built the first cities, created literature when everywhere else on Earth, as far as anyone knew, humans were still living in small villages. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s and 1930s revealed the royal cemetery with its spectacular grave goods showing incredible craftsmanship. The standard of Ur, the bull-headed lyre, jewellery of gold and lapis lazuli, artefacts demonstrating a level of artistry that seemed impossibly sophisticated for such early dates. The deeper archaeologists dug, the older the dates became, and yet the sophistication remained. The Waka vase from Uruk, dated to 3200-3000 BC, shows artistic skill that wouldn't look out of place 1,000 years later. The earliest cylinder seals from the Uruk IV period around 3300 BC already demonstrate the full development of the form. They're not primitive experiments but fully realised craft. It's this sudden appearance of sophistication that makes the Sumerian civilization archaeologically anomalous. Most cultures show gradual development in their artefact record. Pottery improves over centuries, architectural techniques evolve, writing systems begin pictographic and slowly become more abstract. Sumerian cuneiform does show this evolution, but compressed into an impossibly short period. Within 200 years, it goes from simple pictographs to a complete writing system capable of recording complex literature. The earliest texts are already grammatically sophisticated. Mainstream archaeology explains this through invisible prehistory, assuming there must have been a longer developmental period that simply hasn't been found yet. This is reasonable and probably correct, but it means we're inferring development we haven't observed to explain sophistication we have observed. The Sumerians didn't infer this development, they stated directly where their civilization came from. The Anunnaki. 7 sages called the Apkallu, the god Enki transferring the me from the city of Eridu. We have dozens of texts making these claims, not vague mythological references, specific claims. The tablet known as the Eridu Genesis describes the founding of the first cities and names the Anunnaki as the founders. The Sumerian king list, which we'll examine in detail later, begins with when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not developed in Eridu, lowered to Eridu from heaven. The Akkadian text, known as the Poem of the Supersage, describes the 7 Apkallu who came before the flood, stating they completed the plans of heaven and earth. These sages are consistently depicted in art as human-like but with wings, or as fish-garbed figures emerging from water. Not symbolic representations according to the texts, actual descriptions. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek around 280 BC, recorded traditions from much earlier Sumerian sources. He described a being called Oannes, one of the Apkallu, who emerged from the Persian Gulf and taught the people of the city of Eridu writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, and architecture. Berossus states explicitly that Oannes was not human, that he would return to the sea at night, and that since that time nothing further has been discovered in terms of fundamental knowledge. Now, Berossus is late, writing 2,500 years after the events he describes, but he claims to be preserving traditions from temple libraries, and the details he provides match what earlier texts describe. The consistency spans 3 millennia of written record. So we're faced with a civilization that appears archaeologically with remarkable suddenness, that possesses sophisticated technology and art immediately, and that consistently describes this sudden appearance as the result of instruction by beings called the Anunnaki. We can interpret this as myth, as cultural memory distorted by time, as priests inventing origin stories to legitimize their authority, all valid interpretations employed by scholars. Or we can consider whether the consistency exists because the core claim that something instructional happened at the beginning preserves information. We're not in position to judge yet. We've only established the framework. But as we proceed, keep this question present. If the Sumerians were inventing their history, would we expect the kind of consistency we observe? Would we expect the visual record to match the textual record so precisely? Would we expect the same names, same attributes, same relationships preserved across thousands of years? Or does that level of consistency suggest something else? Not proof, suggestion. The evidence is ahead. First, we need to understand how we read that evidence at all, because the key to understanding Sumerian claims about the Anunnaki isn't just archaeology, it's language. What did they actually call these beings? What words did they use? What did those words literally mean before centuries of scholarly interpretation reshaped them into comfortable mythology? The language itself holds clues, and as we're about to see, those clues become visible only when we look at the original terms the Sumerians inscribed on clay over 4,000 years ago. The language of the gods. Picture a clay tablet, roughly the size of a modern smartphone but thicker, heavier, warm, still damp from the river clay mixed with straw to prevent cracking. A scribe sits cross-legged in the shade of a temple courtyard in Uruk, stylus in hand. The stylus is cut from reed, sharpened to a triangular edge. When pressed into the soft clay at an angle, it makes a wedge-shaped mark. The scribe doesn't draw lines, he makes impressions. Combinations of wedges form signs. Signs form words. Words form sentences. Sentences record everything from grain receipts to cosmic genealogies. This is cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, the writing system that preserved Sumerian civilization for us. But for 2,000 years, no one could read it. The last cuneiform texts were written in 75 C in the city of Babylon. After that, the knowledge died. The script became decoration on ruins, meaningless marks on incomprehensible tablets. Scholars in medieval times saw these marks, but had no framework for understanding them. They assumed they were ornamental. Some thought they were natural formations in the clay. The revival began with European travellers in the 17th century, bringing back copies of inscriptions from Persepolis. By the early 19th century, scholars had identified cuneiform as writing and distinguished 3 different types of the script, each representing a different language. But reading it required something that didn't exist, a bilingual inscription, like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Behistun inscription provided this key. Carved into a limestone cliff in western Iran, rising 100 meters above the ground, the inscription contains the same text in 3 scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, a late form of Akkadian. The text commemorates victories of the Persian king Darius I, written around 520 BCE. Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer stationed in Persia, spent years copying the inscription. He worked suspended by ropes, balanced on narrow ledges, risking death with every expedition up the cliff face. His courage gave scholarship its breakthrough. By comparing the known names in Old Persian with their corresponding signs in the other scripts, he and other scholars gradually worked out phonetic values for cuneiform signs. But this unlocked only Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. When scholars began reading the tablets from Assyrian and Babylonian libraries, they encountered passages that made no sense, lines of text that didn't follow Akkadian grammar, words that didn't fit Semitic vocabulary patterns. The explanation came gradually. These mysterious passages were in a different language entirely, an older language that Akkadian scribes still studied the way medieval monks studied Latin. The Akkadians themselves called this language Ime-Gir, the tongue of Sumer. The discovery shocked Assyriology. Here was a language unlike any known language family, not Semitic, not Indo-European, not related to anything else scholars could identify. An isolate, unique, and clearly much older than Akkadian, because Akkadian texts treated it as an ancient scholarly language by 2000 BCE. Deciphering Sumerian required different techniques than deciphering Akkadian. Akkadian texts often included Sumerian words with Akkadian glosses, translations, or explanations written between the lines. Bilingual dictionaries, copied by scribal students learning the old language, provided word lists. Slowly, painfully, across decades of work by scholars like Francois Thurel Dangin, Arnold Poibil, and Samuel Noah Kramer, Sumerian grammar and vocabulary emerged from the darkness. What they discovered in those texts changed our understanding of human history. Here were the world's oldest literature, hymns, lamentations, epic poems, the world's oldest law codes, the world's oldest mathematical texts showing place value notation and sophisticated calculation techniques, the world's oldest medical texts listing diagnoses and treatments, and texts describing gods, not abstract theology, not philosophical meditation on the divine. Descriptions, names, genealogies, roles, relationships, and over, one term, Anunnaki. Let's examine this word carefully because its meaning matters. In Sumerian cuneiform, the term is written Anunnaki or sometimes Anunna. The sign can mean several things depending on context, water, seed, or a nominative marker. Nun means princely, or alternatively, height heaven. Na can indicate location or origin. Ki means earth or land. The traditional scholarly translation, princely offspring or offspring of Anu, interpreting Nun as deriving from Anu, the sky god, and Naki as indicating terrestrial location, hence those of royal descent dwelling on earth. But there's an alternative reading based on literal sign values that some researchers, looking at the component parts, translate as those who from heaven to earth came. The signs can support this reading, none as heaven, nor as directional from, Ki as earth. This translation appears in some older scholarship and has been revived by researchers examining alternative interpretations. Mainstream Assyriology prefers the princely offspring translation because it treats the Anunnaki as a class of gods, divine beings, yes, but within a mythology framework, heavenly beings taking earthly roles. The alternative reading shifts the meaning subtly but significantly. It emphasizes arrival rather than status, movement from one place to another rather than genealogy. In this reading, the term itself describes a journey from heaven to earth. The texts themselves provide context for which reading makes more sense. In the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki are described working, digging canals, clearing rivers, they complain about the hard labour. This eventually leads to humans being created to take over the work. The text portrays this as a labour dispute between classes of gods. The Anunnaki, doing physical work, rebel. The Igigi, higher-ranking gods, need a solution. If Anunnaki means princely offspring, why are they doing manual labour? Why does the text emphasise their physical work as a grievance? The narrative makes more sense if Anunnaki refers to a group who came to Earth for a purpose, resource extraction, terraforming, whatever terminology fits, and found the work harder than expected. In Inanna's descent to the underworld, the Anunnaki appear as judges. 7 judges sitting in the throne room of Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. They pass judgment on Inanna, who has descended to the land of the dead. The text describes them as having specific authority, specific judicial function. Again, princely offspring works as a translation, but those who came from heaven to earth works equally well if we understand them as a delegation with assigned responsibilities. The Enuma Elish creation epic names the Anunnaki explicitly in Tablet 6. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos, the text states, "When Marduk heard the words of the gods, his heart prompted him to fashion artful works. Opening his mouth, he addressed Ea to impart the plan he had conceived in his heart. I will take blood and fashion bone. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Truly, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." The text continues, Ea answered him, speaking a word to him, giving him another plan for the relief of the gods. Let but one of their brothers be handed over. He alone shall perish, that mankind may be fashioned. Let the great gods be here in assembly. Let the guilty be handed over, that they may endure. Marduk summoned the great gods to assembly. They bound him, holding him before E. They imposed on him his guilt and severed his blood. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. The god who is sacrificed is named Chingu, who had led Tiamat's forces. And the text states the Anunnaki, the great gods, replied to him, to Lugal-Dimarankia, counsellor of the gods, their lord. It was Chingu who contrived the uprising and made Tiamat rebel and join battle. They bound him, holding him before Ea. They imposed on him his guilt and severed his blood. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. He imposed the service and let free the gods. Here the Anunnaki are described as the beneficiaries of human creation. Humans are made that the gods might be at ease, specifically that the Anunnaki might be at ease, relieved of labour. This matches the Atrahasis account, where the Anunnaki's labour complaints drive the decision to create workers. The consistency across texts suggests Anunnaki refers to a specific group with a specific function. They work on Earth. They need labourers. Humans are created to serve that need. Whatever we make of this as mythology or history, the functional role remains clear. Another key term appears repeatedly, Dingir. Written with the star symbol in cuneiform, Dingir is typically translated as God or divine, but the sign originally depicted a star, and the word's etymology may relate to brightness or shining. When texts describe individual Anunnaki, they use the Dingir sign before the name. Dingir Enki means the god Enki, or does it mean the star/shining one Enki? The translation choice creates different implications. God places the being in a religious category. Shining One describes an attribute, possibly a physical attribute. Hebrew texts in the Bible use similar terminology. The word Elohim, usually translated God, is actually plural and can mean gods or heavenly ones or shining ones, depending on context. When the sons of Elohim come to earth and take human wives in Genesis 6, are these divine beings in a metaphysical sense, or physical beings described by their appearance? We're not claiming equivalence between Sumerian and Hebrew concepts. They're different cultures, separated by geography and time. But we're noting that ancient terminology describing these beings often emphasizes light, brightness, shining, attributes, that could be literal descriptions rather than metaphorical divinity. Another Sumerian term worth examining, me. We mentioned these earlier as divine principles or powers. Texts enumerate the me, kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, sexual intercourse, prostitution, music, the art of metalwork, scribeship, craftsmanship, and dozens more. In the poem Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki, god of wisdom. Enki gets drunk during a feast and gifts Inanna the me. She loads them onto her boat and sails away. When Enki sobers up and realises what he's done, he sends servants to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes to Uruk with the me, bringing civilization to her city. The narrative reads like political allegory, perhaps recording the transfer of cultural preeminence from Eridu to Uruk during the Uruk period. But the me themselves are described as physical objects, things that can be carried, loaded onto boats, stolen, not abstract concepts, but concrete items embodying powers. This matters because if me are physical, teachable technologies or knowledge systems, then the texts describing their transfer from gods to humans describe technology transfer, knowledge transfer, which brings us back to the question of what kind of record the Sumerians were keeping. Were they explaining cultural development through metaphor, creating explanatory myths for knowledge they'd actually developed themselves, or were they describing, in the terms available to them, actual transfer of knowledge from an outside source? The language itself doesn't answer this, but it stops us from being too confident that our translations have captured the original meaning. Every translation is an interpretation. When we translate Dinya as God, we make a choice. When we translate Anunnaki as princely offspring, we make a choice. When we treat me as abstract principles rather than concrete objects, we make a choice. Those choices are often correct. Scholars spend careers mastering these languages, and their expertise deserves respect. But expertise in language doesn't automatically grant expertise in what the language describes. A perfect translation of a text about an event we don't understand will still leave us uncertain about what the event was. The Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki coming to Earth, working on Earth, needing help with their work, creating humans to provide that help, teaching humans civilization, and eventually leaving or diminishing their presence. They wrote about this in multiple texts spanning over 1,000 years. They carved images showing divine figures interacting with humans in ways that suggest physical presence, handing objects, receiving offerings, participating in battles, delivering instructions. Either this represents consistent mythology maintained across a dozen city-states and multiple political upheavals, or it represents consistent documentation of something the culture remembered as foundational. The decipherment of cuneiform gave us access to what the Sumerians said, but it didn't give us certainty about what they meant. It gave us their words. We still have to decide what those words describe. As we turn now to the visual evidence, the seals, the reliefs, the statues, keep the language in mind. When you see depictions of figures labelled gods, remember that gods is our word, not theirs. When you read that these beings descended from heaven, remember that this phrasing comes from the actual Sumerian terminology. When texts describe them teaching, building, creating, remember that the verbs used are the same verbs used for human actions. They're not metaphorical or symbolic verbs. They're active verbs describing physical tasks. The art is about to show us what the texts describe, and the consistency between text and image will raise new questions about what kind of record we're examining. First, we look at the oldest example, the beginning of narrative art in human history. A vase carved in alabaster over 5,000 years ago showing a procession, and at the end of that procession, waiting, receiving, a figure the Sumerians knew very well. Images that speak. Iraq National Museum Baghdad. Object number IM 19606. Height 105 centimeters. Material carved alabaster. Period late Uruk, approximately 3200-3000 BC. Find spot Uruk in the Inanna temple district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna. The Warka vase, named for Warka, the Arabic name for ancient Uruk, one of the earliest surviving examples of narrative relief sculpture in the world, carved over 5,000 years ago with such precision that every figure remains identifiable, every detail speaks. The vase was found in fragments during excavations in the 1930s, reconstructed from dozens of pieces. It disappeared during the looting of the Iraq National Museum in 2003, a theft that sent archaeologists into despair. It was irreplaceable, ancient beyond reckoning. 3 months later, it reappeared, returned anonymously, damaged but recoverable, still speaking. What does it say? The vase is divided into 4 horizontal registers, bands of imagery that circle the circumference, designed to be read from bottom to top, like ascending a ziggurat or climbing toward heaven. The bottom register shows water, wavy lines representing rivers or irrigation channels, and plants, barley and date palms, the staple crops of Sumer. This is the natural world, the foundation of agriculture that allows civilization. But notice, these aren't wild plants. These are cultivated crops, arranged in neat rows. This is agriculture, not nature, order imposed on chaos. The second register shows animals, sheep and cattle in procession, all facing right, moving in the same direction. Again, these aren't wild creatures. These are domesticated livestock, the herds that provided meat, milk, leather and wool, the foundation of pastoral economy. The third register shows humans, naked men in procession, each carrying a vessel or basket. They're bringing offerings, agricultural products, rendered goods from their labour. The offerings pile up, accumulate, flowing towards something outside the frame of this register. The fourth register, the top, shows where the offerings go. Here the relief becomes more detailed, the carving more careful. On the right stands a large figure, larger than the others, which in ancient Near Eastern art signifies greater importance. This figure wears an elaborate garment, a netted skirt with a long decorative element falling behind. Before this figure sit 2 tall poles, each topped with a distinctive ribbon symbol that represents Inanna, goddess of love, war, fertility, and the planet, Venus. Before these poles stands a smaller male figure, also in ceremonial dress, this one with a long skirt and exposed upper body. He carries offerings toward the large figure. Behind him, the procession continues, attendants bringing more goods, more offerings. The large figure in the netted skirt is Inanna, or more precisely, a representation that every Sumerian viewer would have recognized immediately as Inanna or her priestess. Possibly the two concepts weren't distinguished, the high priestess embodying the goddess, or the goddess manifesting through the priestess. The text suggests the lines could blur. The male figure presenting offerings is most commonly identified as the king or chief priest of Uruk. Some scholars argue it depicts the sacred marriage ceremony, the ritual union between the king and Inanna's priestess that ensured fertility for the land and legitimacy for the ruler. This is the mainstream interpretation, a ceremonial scene depicting religious ritual, showing the proper relationship between human and divine, between ruler and deity. The offerings flow upward through the registers from nature to goddess, demonstrating the proper order of society, nature cultivated, animals herded, humans labouring, all directing resources to the temple where the goddess resides. It's a compelling interpretation. It fits what we know about Sumerian religion, temple economics, and royal ideology. The vase becomes a statement of cosmic order made physical. But let's look at what's literally depicted before we interpret. The image shows a figure, larger than others, receiving goods. This figure stands beside symbols of identity, the poles with ribbons, as if those symbols announce who this is. The offerings are substantial: baskets of food, jars of what might be oil or beer, textiles. The procession of naked workers suggests this isn't a one-time ceremony, but ongoing provision, regular supply. The figure receiving these goods is positioned at a table or altar with vessels arranged. Behind the figure, though damaged in the original and difficult to make out in some reconstructions, appears to be an architectural element, possibly indicating the interior of a building or sanctuary. If we strip away interpretation and describe only what the carving shows, there is a figure distinguished by size and dress, receiving regular deliveries of food and goods from an organised labour force within or near a significant building. This could describe religious ceremony. It could also describe economic administration, or both simultaneously the temple as economic centre. But here's what makes the Walk of Ace significant for our investigation. It shows direct interaction. The king or priest isn't worshipping from a distance. He's handing goods directly to the goddess figure. She's present, right there, receiving. Ancient Near Eastern art often depicts gods as distant, in the sky, in separate divine realms, observing from above. But here, at the earliest edge of civilization, the art shows proximity, physical proximity, a transaction taking place in shared space. The imagery implies presence, not metaphorical presence, physical presence. Mainstream interpretation would say, of course it shows physical presence, because the ritual involved the physical presence of the priestess embodying the goddess. The carving depicts the ritual, and rituals happen in physical space. True. But the Sumerians made a distinction between representation and presence. They had statues of gods for worship, stand-ins for the divine. But they also described instances where the gods themselves were present, not represented. The texts make this distinction. The language differentiates. The work of ours predates those texts by centuries, so we can't cross-reference its specific ceremony with written descriptions. But we can note that the artistic choice was to show the divine figure the same way the human figures are shown: solid, physical, present in the same space, participating in the same moment. Not a statue of Inanna, not a symbol of Inanna. The imagery suggests Inanna herself, or her priestess, so fully identified with her that distinction becomes meaningless. This pattern, direct interaction, shared physical space, will repeat in the evidence ahead. Cylinder seals, reliefs, statues consistently show human and divine figures together, engaged in common activities, occupying the same ground. It's worth pausing on this because modern religious art doesn't typically work this way. Christian medieval art shows God in heaven, saints in halos, clear visual distinction between earthly and heavenly realms. Hindu art shows gods with multiple arms or blue skin, clear markers of supernatural difference. Buddhist art shows the Buddha in meditation, present but withdrawn from worldly action. Sumerian art shows gods identifiable by symbols, horned crowns, specific attributes, but physically similar to humans, engaged in human activities, fighting battles, receiving food, handing objects, issuing instructions. The question is whether this artistic choice reflects theology imagined as human-like, or record-keeping beings remembered as human-like. We can't answer from one artifact. But the Walk of Ace establishes the pattern we'll see repeated. When Sumerians depicted interactions with the divine, they depicted them as physical interactions in shared space. The vase also shows something else worth noting: hierarchy through size. Inanna's figure is larger than the king's figure, which is larger than the workers' figures. Ancient Near Eastern art uses size to indicate importance, not to show physical reality. The king isn't literally twice as tall as his subjects, or isn't he? The texts describe the early kings, the antediluvian rulers we'll examine later, as having extraordinary stature. Gilgamesh, the famous king of Uruk from the early dynastic period, is described in the Epic of Gilgamesh as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, whatever that means physiologically, but is also described as extraordinarily tall, strong, physically imposing beyond normal human capacity. Are these descriptions metaphorical, the hero necessarily described as larger than life, or do they preserve information about actual physical differences? If the Anunnaki were physical beings, would they necessarily have been human-sized? If they came from elsewhere, developed under different conditions, might they have been larger? Is the size differential in the art showing status, or is it showing something remembered about actual proportions? We're speculating now, extending beyond what the evidence states. But the question is worth asking. Why does the art consistently show divine figures as larger when it could show them as separate, as above, as in another realm entirely? The choice to show them larger, but in the same frame, suggests they were remembered as present, but different. The Walker vase served a function, likely ceremonial, possibly displayed during festivals. Every time it was used, every time Sumerian citizens saw it, they received a message. This is how our world works. Nature serves humans. Humans serve the temple. The temple connects to the divine. And that divine presence receives, responds, participates. Whether this message described religious belief or documented actual economic and political structure, it established the paradigm for thousands of years of Mesopotamian civilization. The gods were not distant. They were involved. They required service. They granted legitimacy. And they could be depicted, carved in stone, recognized by symbols and attributes, as if they were known, as if they'd been seen. 5,000 years later, that vase still speaks. It still shows a procession leading to a presence. It still depicts transaction, relationship, mutual participation in civilization. The Sumerians could have carved any scene they wanted on that vase. They chose this one. They chose to show humans bringing the products of their labour to a figure identified as divine, and that figure receiving those products in what appears to be shared physical space. It's the beginning of a visual language that will continue for millennia, a language showing gods not as abstract forces, but as agents, actors, participants. The next evidence makes this even clearer, because while the Walker vase shows one ceremonial moment, cylinder seals show hundreds of moments, personal moments, individual interactions. And they tell us something the monumental art might not. These interactions weren't just royal or priestly, they were pervasive. Ordinary people carried images of divine figures on their personal seals, rolled those images across their contracts, their letters, their business dealings, identified themselves in relation to specific gods, as if those relationships were real, ongoing, significant. The seals show us a civilization that didn't just worship distant deities, they showed a civilization that documented proximity. Cylinder seal testimony. Imagine you're a merchant in Uruk, 2400 BC. You've negotiated a contract for 60 bushels of barley to be delivered to a temple administrator in Nippur. The agreement is recorded on a clay tablet, quantities, dates, penalties for non-delivery. Both parties need to authenticate the document, prevent later alteration, ensure legal validity. You reach into the pouch at your belt and withdraw a small stone cylinder, perhaps 2 centimetres in diameter, 3 centimetres long, pierced lengthwise so it can be worn on a cord around your neck. The surface is carved in reverse with an intricate scene, you standing before the sun god Shamash, who sits on a throne and extends a rod and ring, symbols of justice and authority, toward you. Behind you stands your personal deity, your hand raised in a gesture of introduction or supplication. You roll this cylinder across the damp clay of the tablet, near your name. The carving leaves its impression, suddenly visible as a positive image, a small rectangular scene embedded in the document. The temple administrator does the same with his seal. Now the contract is authenticated. Your personal symbols, tied to you, tied to your relationship with the divine, testify to the agreement. This was cylinder seal technology, part signature, part identity card, part spiritual connection. And across thousands of these seals, spanning centuries of use, we see the same pattern, humans depicted alongside gods, in scenes suggesting relationship, contact, mutual recognition. The British Museum holds one of the world's largest collections of cylinder seals, thousands of them from every period of Mesopotamian history. Walking through the galleries, case after case displays these tiny objects, each one a window into how ancient people visualized the divine. Let's return to the Seal of Adda, catalogue number 1891,509.2553, which opened our investigation. It dates to the Akkadian period, roughly 2300 BCE, carved from green serpentine stone. When rolled across clay, it produces an image approximately 3.9 centimeters high and 8.5 centimeters wide. The scene it depicts has become one of the most studied in Mesopotamian iconography because it shows multiple deities in a single frame, each identifiable by specific attributes arranged in a narrative sequence. From left to right, first, a deity with wings and a weapon striding forward. This is likely Ninurta, god of war and hunting, identifiable by his aggressive stance and martial attributes. Next, the goddess Ishtar Arcadian equivalent of Sumerian Inanna. She is identifiable by the weapons rising from her shoulders, swords or possibly date palm fronds, her symbol. She stands on a lion, an animal associated with her. She wears a horned crown, the defining attribute of divinity in Mesopotamian art. Centre of the composition, the sun god Shamash. Rising between two mountains, rays emanate from his shoulders. He holds in his right hand a serrated blade, his saw, the tool he uses to cut through the mountains at dawn. His left hand is raised. The mountains themselves are rendered as two shapes with distinctive flat tops, the cosmic mountains at the edge of the world, where sun rises. To the right, the water god Ea Onyameton. His attributes are unmistakable. Streams of water flow from his shoulders, and in those streams swim fish. This iconography appears so consistently for Ea Enki that when you see a figure with water and fish, identification is certain. Behind him stands a smaller figure, his two-faced minister Usmu, who looks both forward and back simultaneously. At the far right, a small worshipper figure and the inscription Adda, the scribe. This seal belonged to a scribe named Adda. It served as his personal identifier, his signature rolled across documents, his claim to professional authority sanctioned by divine witness. But look at what it depicts. Not abstract divine symbols, not distant gods in celestial realms. Four deities in a scene that suggests specific moment, specific location, the dawn, when sun rises between mountains, when water god stands witness, when warrior and goddess attend the event. The carving quality is extraordinary. Each figure's posture, gesture, and attributes are precisely rendered despite the tiny scale. The artist who carved this seal in reverse, remember the carving process, requires visualizing the final positive image while cutting away stone in mirror image, possessed remarkable skill. More importantly, the artist knew exactly what to depict. The scene follows established conventions that were consistent across hundreds of seals. When you see rays from shoulders, that's Shamash. When you see water streams and fish, that's Enki. When you see horned crown, that marks divinity. This visual language was standardized, shared across Mesopotamian culture. Why does this matter? Because standardization suggests documentation. When every artist depicts Enki with water streams in the same way, across different cities, different time periods, different patron preferences, that consistency implies the depiction preserves information. Not just Enki is associated with water as abstract concept, but Enki appears this way as description. Compare this to Christian iconography. Saints have attributes, St. Peter has keys, St. Sebastian has arrows, but these are symbolic. The keys represent authority given by Jesus. The arrows represent his martyrdom. They're not descriptions of what Peter and Sebastian look like. They're memory aids for identification. Mesopotamian divine attributes sometimes work symbolically too, but water flowing from Enki's shoulders isn't symbolic of his association with water, it depicts water flowing. The fish aren't symbols of aquatic realm, they're fish, swimming in actual streams. The difference is subtle, but significant. Symbolic attributes stand for something else. Descriptive attributes show what's there. Another famous seal in the British Museum collection, known as the Temptation Seal, BM 89326, shows two figures seated on either side of a tree, with a serpent standing upright behind one of them. This seal has generated enormous debate because of its superficial similarity to the Genesis account of Eden. But the scene almost certainly depicts something from Sumerian mythology, possibly related to the plant of immortality Gilgamesh seeks, possibly showing Ningishida, the serpent god. What matters isn't biblical connection. What matters is that the seal depicts gods in anthropomorphic form engaged in specific actions, sitting, guarding, holding objects. The composition suggests narrative, something happening, not just symbolic arrangement. Hundreds of seals show presentation scenes, a human introduced to a seated deity by another divine figure. The human is smaller, often in posture of respect or supplication. The deity sits on a throne, sometimes holding rod and ring symbols. The intermediary god places a hand on the human's shoulder or raises a hand toward the seated figure. These scenes are formulaic. Nearly identical compositions appear on seals from different periods, different cities, different owners. The formula consists of human supplicant plus, divine intermediary plus, supreme deity plus, often a table with offerings plus, sometimes divine symbols in the field above. Scholars interpret these as showing religious devotion, the seal owner depicting himself being introduced to a god by his personal protective deity. It represents aspiration toward divine favour, documentation of spiritual relationship, perhaps record of temple initiation or priestly status, all plausible. But notice what the imagery actually shows: access. The human doesn't worship from afar, he stands before the deity, close enough to touch, in the same room, on the same ground. The intermediary deity bridges not infinite metaphysical distance, but social distance, like a courtier introducing a subject to a king. The composition echoes royal court protocol. When foreign ambassadors visited Mesopotamian kings, they were presented formally by court officials. The king sat enthroned. The ambassador approached with offerings. The official testified to the ambassador's legitimacy. The seal imagery follows this protocol exactly, as if divine audience functioned like royal audience, as if the gods held court the way human kings did, as if the structures of power replicated from heaven to earth, or more precisely, from wherever the gods ruled to where humans lived. In the Akkadian period seal, known as VA 243, held in Berlin's Vorderasiatisches Museum, the central scene shows a seated figure, likely Enlil, chief of the Akkadian pantheon, granting agriculture to humans. A plough appears in the scene. Attendant figures surround the central transaction. This seal has generated controversy because of Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation, claiming it depicts our solar system, including planets, unknown to ancient astronomy. The star symbols in the field above the figures, Sitchin argued, showed the sun surrounded by 11 planets, including a hypothetical 12th planet called Nibiru. Mainstream scholarship rejects this interpretation entirely. The star symbols are not planets, they're divine symbols, markers of deity following standard Mesopotamian convention. The central star likely represents the star of Shamash or Ishtar. Nothing in cuneiform text associated with this seal or similar seals suggests astronomical interpretation. But set aside Sitchin's claims. Look at what the seal actually shows: transfer of knowledge. A deity giving humans a tool, agriculture, represented by the plough. The scene depicts teaching, technology transfer. This matches textual accounts we examined earlier. The me, the principles of civilization, transferred from Enki to humans. The seven sages, the Apkallu, teaching city building, writing, law, crafts. The seal provides visual documentation of what the texts describe, a moment when gods gave humans knowledge. If we were documenting technology transfer today, we might photograph the moment. Take a picture of the teacher handing the tool to the student, demonstrating its use, explaining its function. The seal does exactly this: captures the moment of transfer, makes it permanent, carries it as personal testimony. This happened. This is how we learned. Thousands of seals exist in museum collections worldwide. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds an extensive collection from their excavations at Nippur. The Louvre has hundreds. Yale University's Babylonian collection preserves many. Each museum has catalogues, many available online, where you can examine impressions and photographs. Scroll through these collections and a pattern emerges. Humans and gods share space. They interact. They perform activities together, fighting enemies, making offerings, receiving blessings, conducting rituals, building structures. The gods are distinguishable by size, by horned crowns, by specific attributes, weapons, animals, streams of water, but they occupy the same ground plane. They're not floating in clouds or emerging from separate realms. They stand on the same baseline as the humans. This consistent artistic choice suggests a worldview where divine and human realms overlapped, where the gods were accessible, where interactions happened regularly enough that depicting them on personal seals made sense, as if these relationships were real, ongoing, significant to daily life. Contrast this with later religious art. Byzantine icons show Christ and saints in gold backgrounds, timeless space, clearly separated from earthly realm. Islamic art traditionally avoids figurative representation of the divine entirely. Hindu art shows gods in cosmos-spanning forms or in clearly mythological contexts, riding animals through clouds, battling demons across dimensional planes. Mesopotamian art shows gods standing next to humans, at the same scale, give or take hierarchical sizing, on the same ground, doing comprehensible things. Either this represents how they imagined gods, in relatable, accessible terms, or how they remembered gods as present, physical, interactive. The seals can't tell us which interpretation is correct, but they preserve a consistent visual testimony. For thousands of years, Mesopotamian people depicted divine human interaction as physical co-presence in shared space. And it wasn't just the seals. Monumental art tells the same story, with even more dramatic implications, because when you carve gods into stone reliefs, standing 3 meters tall, when you show them participating in warfare with weapons in hand, when you depict them receiving prisoners and counting bodies, you're documenting something specific. You're showing gods at war, the warrior gods, the Louvre Museum, Paris, Richelieu Wing, ground floor, room 2, devoted to Mesopotamian antiquities. Against the wall stands a monument that's impossible to ignore even in fragments. The Stele of the Vultures, catalogue numbers AO50, AO2346, AO2348, AO66109, 5 fragments of what was once a limestone monument standing over 1.8 metres tall, discovered at Tello, ancient Jersu, in the 1880s, dated to approximately 2450 BC, early dynastic III period. The stele commemorates the victory of Eannetum, king of Lagash, over the neighbouring city-state of Umma, a border dispute, a war, and carved into the stone, the reason the conflict matters to our investigation, the gods participated. Look at the largest fragment, AO2346. The carving shows a massive figure holding a net. Inside the net, small human figures, enemies, are trapped, their heads protruding from the mesh. The large figure wears a horned crown. This is Ningirsu, patron god of Lagash. And he's not blessing the battle from heaven, he's fighting in it. The god holds the net in one hand. The net itself is labelled in cuneiform as a divine weapon, the enemy net, and in the other hand he holds a mace. At his feet lie the bodies of the defeated. The carving is explicit. Ningirsu has captured Uma's soldiers in his net and is about to strike them with his weapon. Below this scene, other fragments show the human side of the battle. King Eannatum leads his forces. The phalanx of soldiers marches in tight formation, shields overlapping, spears levelled. War chariots charge. The wounded fall. Vultures pick at corpses, hence the stale's modern name. But the divine scene occupies the position of honour, the highest register, the most prominent placement. The message carved in stone, Lagash won because Ningirsu fought for them. The accompanying cuneiform inscription provides details. It describes the conflict's origins. Umma had violated treaty boundaries, seized irrigation water belonging to Lagash. Eannatum, following orders from Ningirsu delivered through omens and dreams, mobilised his army. The text states, Ningirsu, warrior of Enlil, set the great net for Umma, he struck it down. There were 3,600 men who were killed, the number is specific. Not symbolic many enemies, but counted casualties, as if someone tallied bodies, documented losses. The text continues describing territorial restoration, treaty terms, and dire warnings against future violations. Standard ancient Near Eastern victory monument content. But threaded through the political narrative is constant reference to divine command, divine support, divine presence. Was this propaganda? Certainly. Every victory monument serves propaganda purposes, legitimizing the victor, demoralizing enemies, justifying violence through claims of higher authority. But look at how the propaganda functions. Eannatum could have claimed divine blessing, divine approval, divine favour from afar. Instead, the monument shows Ningirsu personally on the battlefield, weapon in hand, killing enemies. Why make that specific claim? Why depict the god as physically present warrior rather than distant supporter? Other interpretations suggest the carved image represents metaphor. Ningirsu's net might symbolise the king's military strategy. The divine figure represents the city's strength personified. The whole composition functions as religious poetry in stone. Possible. But if it's metaphor, the Sumerians didn't mark it as such. The horned crown that identifies Ningirsu as divine is the same horned crown worn by gods in every other context. Seals, statues, ritual objects. The mace he holds is depicted the same way actual maces are depicted in human hands. The bodies at his feet are shown with the same artistic conventions used for human casualties elsewhere on the stele. The carving doesn't use visual language suggesting metaphor. It uses visual language suggesting documentation. Move to the British Museum now. Catalogue number 1928,1010.3. The Standard of Ur, discovered by Leonard Woolley during excavations of the Royal Cemetery at Ur in the 1920s. Dated to 2600 BC, early dynastic III period. The object is a hollow wooden box, 21.6 centimetres wide, 49.5 centimetres long. Both faces are decorated with shell, red limestone and lapis lazuli inlays set in bitumen, showing intricate mosaic scenes. The two sides are traditionally called war and peace. The war side shows military campaign in 3 registers. Bottom, chariots charging, trampling enemies, wheels crushing bodies. Middle, infantry marching prisoners, presenting captives to officers. Top, the king, larger than other figures, receives the prisoners. Before him stand his soldiers. Behind him sits his chariot. At the very top of the composition, in the position of honour above even the king, appear symbols, divine symbols, standards topped with the symbolic animals of gods, the lion of Ishtar, possibly the bull of storm deities. The peace side shows celebration, a banquet, musicians playing lyres, servants bringing goods, animals being led for feast. Again, the king dominates the top register, cup in hand, presiding over victory celebration. What's significant, the war side shows divine symbols above human action, but the peace side shows the king in the supreme position. No divine figures above him. The interpretation, war requires divine sanction, shown by placing divine symbols above the king. Peace is human domain, shown by king's uncontested supremacy at banquet. But notice what this implies. War isn't just blessed by gods, it's overseen by them. Their symbols witness the violence. Their presence, even if represented symbolically, legitimizes the slaughter. The Sumerians could have depicted war as purely human action and peace, as divinely blessed. They chose the opposite. Violence required divine attendance. Celebration was human domain. Why? Perhaps because war determined territory, resources, survival, stakes too high for human authority alone. Perhaps because battlefield success seemed impossible to guarantee through human means alone, so divine participation explained victory. Or perhaps because warfare in the early dynastic period involved direct participation by beings the Sumerians identified as gods, and the art documents this participation. We can't know from artifacts alone, but we can note the pattern. Mesopotamian art consistently places divine figures in contexts of violence, power, and royal authority. Gods aren't just worshipped, they're consulted before battle. They appear on battlefields. They receive victory spoils. The texts support this pattern. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu plan to kill Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, they receive weapons from the gods. The text describes these weapons, specific swords, specific axes, not blessed ordinary weapons, divine weapons, brought from heaven. When they kill Humbaba, the goddess Ishtar appears, physically manifests according to the text, and propositions Gilgamesh. When he rejects her, she goes to her father Anu and demands the bull of heaven be sent to punish Uruk. Anu initially refuses, citing the catastrophe it will cause. Ishtar threatens to raise the dead if he doesn't comply. Anu relents. The bull of heaven descends, literally descends in the text, and begins destroying Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight it, kill it, tear out its heart, and present it to Shamash. Enkidu throws the bull's hindquarter at Ishtar, who is watching from Uruk's walls. She curses them. The narrative reads like action, not metaphor. Specific beings doing specific things in specific locations. The gods appear, interact, threaten, fight, die in the bull's ace, and depart. Later, when the gods gather in council to decide Enkidu's fate, he must die for killing Humbaba and the bull. The text describes the deliberation. Different gods take different positions. Shamash argues for mercy. Enlil insists on punishment. Eventually consensus emerges. Enkidu must die. Gilgamesh will be spared. The council functions like human political assembly. Debate, voting, enforcement of decision. Not inscrutable divine mystery, but comprehensible political process scaled to cosmic level. If these beings were present and physical, would their decision-making processes resemble human political processes? Would they have hierarchies, disputes, negotiations? Or would we expect something utterly alien, incomprehensible through human categories? The Mesopotamian texts consistently describe divine politics in human terms. Assemblies, voting, treaties, wars, alliances, betrayals, as if the gods operated by rules analogous to human society, or as if human society modelled itself on earlier divine patterns. Another text, the myth known as Lugali, describes Ninurta's war against the demon Asug. Ninurta, god of war, uses divine weapons including the Shurur, his talking mace. The Shurur scouts ahead, reports back on enemy positions, advises strategy. When Ninurta defeats Asag, the text describes geological changes resulting from the battle. Mountains formed, rivers diverted, stone types created. Is this geological poetry, explaining natural features through battle mythology, or description of actual large-scale terraforming, described in terms available to Sumerian language? The text says Ninurta built a stone wall to contain floodwaters, creating irrigation systems. It lists specific stones by name, diorite, alabaster, limestone, and explains their properties and uses. The detail suggests practical knowledge embedded in mythological framework. Similarly, the Enuma Elish describes Marduk's battle with Tiamat in terms that some researchers interpret as cosmogony, the creation of ordered cosmos from primordial chaos, but that could also describe large-scale engineering. Marduk splits Tiamat, making heaven from one half and earth from the other. He establishes the courses of stars, assigns duties to gods, creates humanity. The text presents this as creation narrative, explaining cosmic structure, but the vocabulary used is active, physical, constructive. Marduk doesn't contemplate cosmos into existence. He builds it, organizes it, divides it, assigns it. If advanced beings were terraforming a planet, establishing infrastructure, organizing resources, implementing systems, and you were a Sumerian scribe recording this from accounts passed down through generations, how would you describe it? What vocabulary would you use? What metaphors would serve? You might describe it exactly as the Enuma Elish does. Battle representing conflict between different factions. Victory representing success of one approach. Creation representing the results of massive engineering projects. Gods representing the agents doing the work. We're speculating now, extending interpretation beyond what evidence demands. But the speculation reveals something important. The texts can support multiple readings. They're compatible with pure mythology. They're also compatible with historical documentation described in mythological language. The art adds weight to the documentation interpretation because it doesn't show metaphorical conflict. It shows specific beings with specific weapons doing specific violence to specific enemies. The Stele of the Vultures shows Ningirsu's net full of actual human bodies. The Standard of Ur shows chariots crushing actual soldiers. These aren't abstract battles between cosmic principles. They're documented military campaigns with casualty counts and territorial outcomes. And the gods weren't absent from those campaigns. They were invoked, consulted, depicted as participants, thanked for victory, blamed for defeat. Either the Sumerians imagined divine involvement so vividly they couldn't separate it from historical events, or they documented actual involvement by beings they identified as gods. The evidence doesn't resolve this question, but it establishes that Mesopotamian warfare was fundamentally entangled with belief about divine presence. Wars were launched on divine command. Battles were fought with divine weapons. Victories were attributed to divine action. This pattern continues throughout Mesopotamian history. Assyrian kings of the 1st millennium BC, over 1,000 years after the Stele of the Vultures, still described military campaigns as divinely commanded, victories as divinely granted, enemies as defeated by specific named gods. The continuity suggests deep cultural conviction. The gods were not distant observers. They were invested participants in human affairs, particularly in matters of war, kingship, and territorial control. And sometimes, according to the texts, they communicated not through omens or priestess interpretation, but directly, through dreams, through visions, through appearances that the texts describe as physical, specific, and instructional. which brings us to one of the most detailed accounts of divine-human interaction in Sumerian literature, the Cylinders of Gudea, where a king receives architectural plans from a god, describes the dream in extraordinary detail, and builds exactly what was shown to him. If that account is historical, it documents direct technology transfer. If it's mythological, it's remarkably specific mythology, listing materials, measurements, and construction techniques with engineering precision. The boundary between categories blurs again, and the artifacts wait to testify. Dreams and blueprints. The Louvre Museum holds approximately 27 statues of a single ruler, Gudea-Ensi, Thoma or Pic, of the city-state of Lagash, who ruled around 2144-2124b during the Neo-Sumerian period. 27 statues, all of the same man, each inscribed with cuneiform texts, each commissioned by Gudea himself, installed in temples throughout his territory. This wasn't vanity. This was documentation. One statue in particular, actually a pair of statues, catalogue numbers AO 3293 and AO 4108, shows Gudea holding on his lap what appears to be an architectural plan. The tablets resting on his knees show the layout of a temple, including measurements. But the real information is in the cylinders. Gudea's cylinders A and B, two massive clay cylinders covered entirely with cuneiform text. Over 1,400 lines of Sumerian poetry describing in exhaustive detail the construction of the Ininu, the temple of Ningisu in Girsu. The text begins with a problem. Gudea doesn't understand why the rituals aren't working, why the gods seem distant, why prosperity isn't flowing to Lagash. He performs divination, he fasts, he prays, and then he dreams. The dream sequence takes up substantial portion of Cylinder A. In the dream, a man appears to Gudea. The text describes him. In the dream, there was a man. He was enormous. By his crown, he was a god. By his wings, he was the Anzu bird. By his lower parts, he was a flood wave. Mixed attributes, human-like in body, divine crown rod implicitly, wings like the Anzu divine bird's creature, lower body like flood wave. The description suggests composite form, or possibly describes clothing equipment that resembled these things. This figure speaks to Gudea, commanding him to build a temple. But Gudea doesn't understand the instructions. The figure shows him a tablet. The text says a tablet of lapis lazuli, with a plan of a building drawn on it. Then a woman appears. The text describes her a woman. Who was she? She carried a golden stylus. She held a tablet of stars on her knees. She was consulting it. Two more figures appear. A divine warrior holding a weapon, and a donkey pawing the ground impatiently beside a chariot, ready to depart. Gudea wakes confused. The dream was vivid, but incomprehensible. He doesn't know who the figures were, what the tablet meant, why the donkey was impatient. So he does what any Sumerian ruler would do. He consults a divine dream interpreter. He travels to the goddess Nanshi, expert in dreams. He describes everything he saw. Nanshi explains the man was Ningirsu himself, commanding construction of his temple. The tablet showed the building plan. The woman was Nisaba, goddess of writing and wisdom, holding the stellar tablets, astrological charts, to determine the propitious time for construction. The warrior was Ningasida, Gudea's personal protective deity. The donkey represented Ningirsu's impatience to see the work begin. Nanshi instructs Gudea on how to proceed, purify himself, make offerings, prepare the ground, and await further instruction. Gudea does this, and has a second dream. This time, Ningirsu appears alone and gives detailed specifications. The text preserves these specifications: dimensions of rooms, types of wood required, sources for stone, metalwork requirements, labour organisation, offerings to be made at each construction phase. The detail is extraordinary. The text lists specific materials: cedar from the Amanus Mountains, gold from Hahum, copper from Kimash, diorite from Magan, carnelian from Ethiopia. These are real places, real trade routes, actual materials that archaeological excavation confirms were imported to Sumer. The text describes specific construction techniques, foundations laid in certain patterns, walls built to certain heights, door frames constructed with specific wood joints, roofing beams arranged in specific configurations, and throughout, Gudea emphasizes that he's following divine instruction. He builds nothing according to his own plan. Everything matches what Ningirsu showed him. When the temple is complete, Gudea holds an elaborate dedication ceremony. The text describes this too, the processions, the offerings, the songs, and then Ningirsu takes up residence in the temple. The text says, Ningirsu entered his house. The phrasing suggests physical entrance. The god arrives, inspects the work, approves and settles in. Offerings are brought. Festivals begin. Prosperity returns to Lagash. Mainstream interpretation treats this as religious literature. Gudea legitimizes his construction project, a massive economic undertaking requiring significant resources and labour, by claiming divine command. The dream sequence provides theological justification for political action. The detail about materials and construction demonstrates Gudea's piety and thoroughness. The happy ending validates his reign, all reasonable. But let's examine what the text literally describes before we categorize it. A ruler has a vivid visual experience where a figure appears and shows him building plans on what the text calls a tablet, whether stone tablet or some other object. The figure is described in specific visual terms: enormous size, crown, wings, unusual lower body. Other figures appear with their own specific attributes and actions. The ruler doesn't understand the vision. He seeks expert interpretation from someone known for dream analysis. She explains what he saw, identifies the figures, and provides instructions for proceeding. The ruler follows these instructions and receives more detailed information, specifications for construction, lists of materials with geographic sources, techniques for assembly. He builds according to these specifications. The completed structure matches what was shown in the vision. This sequence could describe 1. Pure religious experience, a dream interpreted through existing theological framework, inspiring a construction project that Gudea then executed according to traditional temple architecture. 2. Political propaganda, Gudea inventing divine authorization for a project he already planned, using dream narrative to legitimize his authority. 3. Actual contact, some form of communication from non-human intelligence providing specific technical information. The text itself supports any of these readings, but certain details are worth noting. The dream doesn't follow typical mythological patterns. Gods in Mesopotamian myths usually appear clearly identifiable, announce themselves by name, deliver unambiguous commands. Gudea's first dream is confusing. He doesn't recognize the figures. He doesn't understand the message. This confusion requires the second interpretive step with Nanshi. If Gudea were inventing the dream for propaganda, why make it confusing? Why introduce a problem that requires solution divine interpretation? Cleaner propaganda would have Ningirsu appear clearly, command clearly, and be obeyed directly. The confusion suggests the text may preserve something about actual experience, whether psychological dream experience or something else. Real dreams are often confusing. Real visions require interpretation. The narrative structure mirrors how humans actually process unclear information. Second, the technical specificity. The text doesn't just say build a temple. It provides a materials list with geographic sources. Archaeological evidence confirms these were actual trade routes. Gudea actually did import diorite from Magan Mun. For his statues, we have the statues carved from diorite, a stone that doesn't occur locally. If the dream were entirely invented, would Gudea bother specifying accurate trade geography, or would he keep it vague, precious stones from distant lands? The specificity suggests either A. Gudea planned the construction thoroughly before inventing the dream narrative and thus included real logistics, or B. the dream actually conveyed specific logistics that Gudea then implemented. Third, the astronomical element, Nisaba holding a tablet of stars and consulting it to determine proper timing. Mesopotamian temples were astronomically aligned. Construction dates were chosen based on celestial observations. The mention of astronomical consultation isn't metaphorical, it describes actual practice. But why include this detail in the dream? If Gudea added astronomical timing in his planning phase, separate from any dream, why attribute that planning to a goddess in the dream showing him star tablets, unless the vision itself included reference to astronomical timing? Unless whoever or whatever communicated the plan also indicated when construction should begin based on celestial configuration. We're reading between lines now. But the text invites this reading because of what it includes and emphasizes. Fourth, the second dream provides information the first didn't. If both dreams were Gudea's psychological creations, they'd likely overlap or repeat. Instead, they sequence: problem posed, interpretation sought, solution provided. That structure suggests information being communicated in stages, with human incomprehension requiring adjustment of communication method. Again, this fits both psychological and contact explanations. Dreams often work in series, with the unconscious mind working through problems across multiple nights. But it also fits contact scenarios where initial communication fails and requires refinement. The completed Ninyu has been excavated. French archaeologists worked at Jiasu from the 1870s through the 1930s. They found Gudea's temple. They found its foundations, its walls, its layout, and they found that it matched descriptions in the cylinder texts. The text claimed divine instruction specified the building. The building was built. The specifications preserved in the text match the archaeological remains. This doesn't prove divine instruction. Gudea could have supervised construction, then written a text describing the building while attributing design to gods. But it demonstrates the text describes a real structure built to documented specifications. Other Mesopotamian texts describe similar divine instruction for construction. The Temple of Solomon in biblical texts receives divine plans delivered to David, who passes them to Solomon for building. Egyptian temple texts describe pharaohs receiving divine instructions for sacred architecture. Across ancient cultures, monumental religious architecture is attributed to divine design. Either this is universal pattern of human psychology, attributing impressive constructions to superhuman source to enhance their authority, or it preserves information about actual technology transfer in deep prehistory. The architectural knowledge required for these temples was considerable. Stone cutting, transportation of multi-ton blocks, precise alignment to celestial features, acoustic engineering, temples enhance sound in specific ways, hydraulic systems for water management. The Sumerians possessed this knowledge. Where did they get it? Conventional answer: developed it gradually through trial and error across generations, with knowledge accumulating through practical experience. Sumerian answer: received it from the Anunnaki, who taught the first sages, who passed it to kings and priests, who built according to divine patterns. Both answers explain the result. Sophisticated temples built with advanced techniques. Both are compatible with the evidence, but the Sumerian answer includes a specific mechanism: instruction through dreams and visions, showing plans, providing specifications, indicating timing. Gudea's cylinders describe this mechanism in operation. A ruler sees plans, seeks interpretation, receives detailed instructions, builds accordingly. If this happened once, it could be dismissed as individual religious experience. But texts from multiple periods describe similar patterns. Kings and priests consistently claim divine instruction for major projects, and they describe this instruction with technical precision, measurements, materials, methods. The precision is what stands out. Vague divine inspiration is universal. Specific technical specifications attributed to divine dreams is more unusual. The statues of Gudea, spread across Lagash temples, served multiple functions. They represented Gudea in perpetual prayer before the gods. They demonstrated his piety, they legitimized his rule, and they documented his achievements. Each statue inscribed with text describing his building projects, his piety, his devotion. But they also served as testimony. I built this. I followed these instructions. The temple stands. The god dwells within. Physical proof of claimed divine human collaboration. Whether that collaboration was real in the way Gudea understood it, or whether it was religious interpretation of his own architectural planning, the result was the same. Temples built, civilization sustained, knowledge preserved. And knowledge was preserved. Temple construction techniques, astronomical alignment principles, irrigation engineering, administrative systems, all passed down through priestly schools, attributed to divine origin, maintained across centuries of political upheaval. The attribution to divine source may have helped preserve the knowledge. If something is merely human invention, it can be changed, improved, replaced. If it's divine instruction, it must be maintained exactly. The theological framework may have served as knowledge conservation system, or the theological framework may have accurately described the source. The evidence doesn't resolve this, but it shows Mesopotamian civilization functioning as if divine instruction was real, as if the gods provided specific information, as if following that information was critical for prosperity. And sometimes that information concerned not just how to build temples, but how to navigate the afterlife, how to face the assembly of judges who weighed souls and determined fate. Judges who, according to the texts, were the Anunnaki themselves, sitting in council in the realm of the dead. The Underworld Assembly, University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, Philadelphia. Catalogue number CBS 6894, a clay tablet fragment measuring approximately 11 by 8 centimetres, excavated from Nippur by the Babylonian expedition of the 1890s, dated to Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, but recording a story far older. The tablet contains lines 380-412 of Inanna's descent to the netherworld, one of the earliest examples of descent mythology in world literature. The complete text, reconstructed from multiple tablet fragments held in different museums, tells the story of the goddess Inanna's journey to the underworld to attend the funeral of her sister Ereshkigal's husband. But something else happens in that underworld, something that reveals how the Sumerians understood power, judgment, and the cosmic order. Inanna descends through 7 gates. At each gate, she must remove one item of clothing or jewellery, her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her ring, her dress, her cosmetics, her royal robe. She arrives before Ereshkigal naked, powerless, stripped of all attributes that made her goddess of heaven. Ereshkigal sits on her throne. Before her sit 7 judges. The text names them the Anunnaki, judges of the underworld. They look at Inanna. The text says they fastened their eyes upon her, the eyes of death. They spoke. The text says they spoke against her, the word which tortures the spirit. And they passed judgment. Inanna is killed, her corpse hung on a hook. Later, Inanna is revived through trickery and escapes. But the scene that matters to our investigation is that moment of judgment. 7 Anunnaki sitting in council, examining a goddess, pronouncing sentence. The Anunnaki here aren't creators, aren't warriors, aren't builders. They're judiciary. They have authority. They deliberate. They execute sentence. The text describes them with a specific phrase that appears across multiple Sumerian compositions. Danunnaki, Dikumes, the Anunnaki, the great gods who determine fates. That phrase, determine fates, literally cut decisions in Sumerian, appears in legal contexts, administrative contexts, anywhere judgment is passed. The Anunnaki in the underworld function as supreme court, with jurisdiction over life and death, with power even over other gods. Why are the Anunnaki judges? Why this specific role? Other Mesopotamian deities have specific, unchanging attributes. Enki is always god of wisdom and water. Inanna, Ishtar, is always goddess of love and war. Shamash is always sun god and god of justice. Their roles remain consistent across texts. The Anunnaki have multiple roles. Sometimes they're labourers, sometimes they're assembly members, Edel, sometimes they're judges in Anna's Descent, other underworld texts. But across these roles, they function collectively. They're a group, a council, an assembly. This structure, divine council making collective decisions, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. Major decisions require assembly. When humans are to be created, the gods gather in assembly. When Enkidu must die, the gods gather in assembly. When the flood is to be sent, the gods gather in assembly, and the Anunnaki are consistently the members of these assemblies. They vote, they debate, they decide. This is worth pausing over because it describes governance structure, not arbitrary divine whim, but organised political process. Proposals are made, arguments presented, votes taken, decisions enforced. Why would the Sumerians imagine divine politics working like human politics? Why not conceive of divine authority as single supreme being issuing commands, or as impersonal cosmic forces, or as mysterious will beyond comprehension? Because human politics work through assemblies. Sumerian city-states were governed by councils of elders, with kings who were sometimes elected, sometimes hereditary, but always accountable to assembly. Major decisions, war, treaties, succession, required council approval. The divine realm mirrors this structure. As above, so below. Or perhaps, as below, so above. Human political systems, modelled on earlier divine systems, observed or remembered. The Anunnaki, as judges, appears in other texts too. In Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, a Sumerian poem predating the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, the text describes the underworld, the Anunnaki, the great gods, sit there in judgment. They pass the sentences of fate. They determine the destinies of everyone. In the death of Gilgamesh, another Sumerian composition, when Gilgamesh dies and enters the underworld, the text describes his reception. He approached the place where the Anunnaki, the judges, sit in the underworld to fix destinies. The consistency suggests this wasn't casual metaphor. The Anunnaki's role as judges was established, known, part of the cosmic structure every Sumerian understood. But what were they judging? The texts don't describe punishment for moral failures. They don't portray the underworld as a place of reward and punishment based on earthly behaviour. That concept appears later in Zoroastrian and eventually Christian theology. Mesopotamian underworld was where everyone went. King and slave, hero and coward, righteous and wicked, all descended to the same dim realm of dust and echoes. The Anunnaki didn't separate good from evil. They determined fate, the span of life allocated, the manner of death, the afterlife status. This is different from judgment as we usually conceive it. It's more administrative. The Anunnaki as underworld judges functioned like registrars, verifying credentials, processing arrivals, assigning status in the afterlife hierarchy. Some individuals received special treatment. Gilgamesh, though mortal, receives honoured place among the dead. Heroes and kings occupied higher status. But this seems based on earthly rank, not moral behaviour. The Anunnaki enforced cosmic bureaucracy. They maintained order in death as in life. Why did Sumerians conceive of afterlife as bureaucratic? Perhaps because their earthly life was bureaucratic. Sumerian civilization ran on administration, records, allocations, assignments, status hierarchies. Extending this into afterlife made sense within their worldview. But there's another interpretation. If the Anunnaki were actual beings who established civilization, they might have established administrative systems both for living management and death processing. If you need to track populations, manage resources, maintain order across large numbers of people, you need bureaucracy. The Anunnaki as administrators make sense if their role was organisational. The texts describe this organisational role explicitly in other contexts. The Enuma Elish, after describing Marduk's victory and creation of humanity, lists the Anunnaki's duties. 50 of them receive assignments in heaven, 50 on earth. Each has specific function, maintaining star courses, managing water systems, supervising agriculture, overseeing crafts. This division of labour, this assignment of specific portfolios, this hierarchy of responsibility, it describes a functioning administrative system, not chaos, not arbitrary divine will, system. And the judges in the underworld were part of that system, the ultimate authority determining fate for everyone, including gods like Inanna. Their power in the underworld suggests they weren't subordinate minor deities. They had authority that even heaven realm gods had to acknowledge. When Inanna descended, she couldn't overrule them. When Enkidu died, Gilgamesh couldn't prevent his friend's appearance before them. When any mortal died, the Anunnaki's judgment was final. Where does this authority come from? In Mesopotamian divine genealogy, the Anunnaki are offspring of Anavan and Ki, making them older than many other gods, including the younger generation of Enki, Enlil, and Inanna. Age conveyed authority in Mesopotamian culture. Elder gods had seniority. This generational structure appears across multiple texts. The oldest gods, primordial figures like Apsu and Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, existed first. They gave birth to the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki gave birth to or created younger gods. The younger gods rebelled or asserted independence. Conflict resulted. Eventually a new order emerged with younger gods ruling, but elder gods maintaining certain prerogatives. This narrative could describe mythological explanation for religious reform, older gods displaced by newer cults, with texts negotiating the transition. But it could also describe actual power transition among a group of beings preserved in mythological form. If the Anunnaki were physical beings who established early civilization, and if a later group arrived or emerged and took over active governance while the Anunnaki retained certain judicial authority, that transition would create exactly the kind of generational divine conflict the texts describe. We're speculating again, but the texts invite speculation because they present consistent, detailed, complex political structures among divine beings. They don't describe simple pantheon of gods with clear roles. They describe factions, families, conflicts, negotiations, treaties, redistributions of power. Human politics is complex because human societies are complex. Divine politics in Sumerian texts is equally complex. Either the Sumerians projected human complexity onto imagined divine realm, or they recorded actual complexity among beings they called gods. The Anunnaki, as judges in the underworld, represents one piece of that complex system. They're not creators that's Enki and Marduk in various texts. They're not kings of heaven that's Anu, then later Enlil, then even later Marduk. They're administrators and judges, maintaining the system, processing outcomes, ensuring order. This role might seem less glorious than warrior or creator, but in Mesopotamian civilization, administrators held real power. Scribes controlled information. Temple officials controlled resources. Judges controlled legal outcomes. Administrative power was substantial power, and the Anunnaki held that power at the cosmic level. They determined fates. Even gods had to answer to them. When Inanna stood before them naked, stripped of power, their judgment was absolute. When humans died and appeared before them, their verdict was final. The texts don't describe appeals process. The Anunnaki spoke, and reality obeyed. This makes them different from other gods who could be negotiated with, pleaded with, bribed with offerings. The Anunnaki's judgment was structural, not personal favour but cosmic law, unless of course we're misreading the texts. Unless the judgment described in underworld texts is symbolic, representing the inexorability of death, the finality of fate, the human confrontation with mortality, the Anunnaki as personified inevitability. That interpretation works too. Most ancient cultures personified abstract forces. Death becomes a god, fate becomes goddesses, war becomes a deity. The Anunnaki could be personified judgment, not actual judges. But if that's the interpretation, why the specific details? Why 7 judges, not 3 or 12? Why the assembly structure rather than single judge? Why the procedural description? They look, they speak, they pronounce sentence, rather than simple Inanna died. The specificity suggests the texts describe a scene as the Sumerians understood it. Whether that scene happened in metaphysical realm or involved beings of some kind, the texts present it as structured, formal, following protocol. And that protocol involved the Anunnaki, always the Anunnaki, across texts, across periods, across different stories, when judgment is needed, when fates are determined, when cosmic decisions are made. The Anunnaki are present. They're consistent. Their role is consistent. Their collective nature is consistent. Their authority is consistent. This consistency, which we've noted before, is what makes Mesopotamian texts unusual. Mythologies typically change. Gods merge, split, change attributes, gain new stories, lose old ones. But the Anunnaki remain remarkably stable across over 1,000 years of textual record. Either Mesopotamian religious conservatism preserved mythology with unusual fidelity, or the Anunnaki weren't mythology, they were record. Information about actual beings, actual roles, actual events, maintained with archival precision because the information was considered historical. The evidence doesn't prove either interpretation, but it demonstrates that Mesopotamian civilization functioned with the Anunnaki as fundamental reference point, creators and judges, labourers and administrators, present at foundation, persistent through history, determiners of fate. And they weren't just described in texts, they were depicted in art, shown in scenes, carved with specific attributes that appear consistently across thousands of artefacts. Those attributes tell us something, because if you wanted to identify specific individuals across multiple depictions, you'd give them distinctive features, consistent markers, visual signatures. The Mesopotamian art does exactly this, and when we examine those attributes carefully, we see a system of identification so precise it suggests documentation of actual appearances, not imagined iconography. Attributes and identities. Look at 500 cylinder seals, examine 100 relief sculptures, study dozens of statues. A pattern emerges so consistent it functions as identification system. Horned crown means divine. Wings means heavenly messenger or specific high-rank gods. Water streams with fish means Enki. Rays from shoulders means Shamash. Lion companion means Ishtar. Plough means agricultural deity, possibly Enlil. Thunderbolt means storm god. Rod and ring means authority, to grant kingship or justice. These attributes appear standardized across centuries, across different cities, across different artistic hands. When an artist carved Enki, water streams appeared. When a sculptor depicted Shamash, rays appeared. The consistency isn't accidental, it's systematic. Why systematize divine attributes? One answer, religious pedagogy. Teach populations to recognize gods, promote proper worship, maintain theological orthodoxy. Standardized iconography serves like brand logo, instant recognition, consistent message. Another answer, documentation. If you're recording appearances of specific beings, you'd note distinctive features. Enki's water streams might describe equipment, water-producing technology, purification systems, something that made flowing water and fish appear. Shamash's rays might describe luminous quality, bright clothing, energy field, something radiant from shoulders. We're not claiming these interpretations are correct. We're noting they're possible. The iconography can be read as symbolic or descriptive depending on framework. Let's examine specific examples. The horned crown appears on every divine figure in Mesopotamian art. multiple horns stacked in tiers, forming distinctive conical crown. The more tiers, the higher the rank. Anu, supreme god of heaven, wears crown with 7 tiers. Lesser gods wear fewer. Why horns? Bulls wore horns. Bulls symbolize strength, fertility, masculine power. Gods wearing bull horns appropriated that symbolism, but the artistic depictions show something specific. These aren't bull horns attached to human head. They're crown-shaped objects with horn-like projections, as if the crown itself is horn-shaped, or as if the crown contains horn-shaped elements. Could this describe actual headgear, some kind of helmet or crown with protrusions? The Sumerian word for this crown is aga, and texts specify it's made of precious materials, gold, silver, sometimes with lapis lazuli inlay, a constructed object, not natural horns. If the Anunnaki wore distinctive headgear for rank identification, for technological function, for cultural tradition, that headgear might be preserved in iconography as horned crown, not symbolic. Descriptive. Water streams from Enki's shoulders. This appears so consistently it's diagnostic. See this feature, identification is certain. Enki Ii, god of wisdom and waters. Why water from shoulders? Symbolic interpretation. Enki is source of fresh water, of irrigation that supports civilization. He embodies the aquifers, the underground water sources, the fertilizing floods. Water from shoulders symbolizes his essence flowing forth. Descriptive interpretation. Enki wore or carried something that produced water streams, tubes, channels, tanks, some system that made water flow from shoulder level. The fish swimming in these streams might be decorative element, or might indicate the water was life-supporting, clean, breathable, if they were water-dwelling beings. Sounds absurd until you consider modern parallel, astronauts' life support system, tubes, tanks. Air/water circulation. Monitoring fish or other organisms to verify water quality was historical practice. Miners carried canaries to detect toxic air. Aquatic civilizations might carry fish to verify water purity. We're not claiming Enki was astronaut with water tanks. We're suggesting the iconography could describe equipment if we allow non-mythological reading. Shamash's rays, always from shoulders, always radiating outward, always associated with sun god or sun's presence. Symbolic, Shamash is sun, rays are sunlight. Iconography represents his solar nature. Descriptive, Shamash wore or generated radiant energy from shoulder area. Light-emitting equipment, reflective materials, energy field, something that made him visibly bright. The texts support radiant interpretation. Descriptions of divine appearances often mention brightness, dazzling light, overwhelming radiance. When gods appear to humans in Mesopotamian texts, the human often can't look directly at them because of brightness. This could be literary exaggeration. Gods so glorious humans are overwhelmed. Or it could describe actual luminosity, beings or equipment bright enough to cause temporary blindness, memorable enough to be recorded as diagnostic feature. Ishtar's lions, she stands on them, rides them, is accompanied by them. Lion symbolizes her martial nature, her fierce sexuality, her dangerous power. But texts also describe her as lion-hearted, as leading armies, as personally dangerous in combat. Her association with lions might be symbolic, or might indicate she actually controlled large predators, trained them, bred them, used them in warfare. Ancient armies used animals. Elephants in Indian and Mediterranean warfare, horses for cavalry, dogs for hunting and fighting. War lions aren't impossible, they're just uncommonly mentioned. But if Ishtar commanded bioengineered or selectively bred predators, that would explain the consistent artistic association. Again, speculative. But the iconography allows multiple readings. Wings on divine figures, some gods have them Nuota, various messenger deities, some don't Enki Enlil. Wings indicate capacity for flight, for movement between heaven and earth, for messenger function. Symbolic, wings represent divine mobility, transcendence, heavenly origin. Descriptive, wings represent flight capability, whether biological wings, winged clothing, or flight technology depicted as wings, because Sumerian art had no other vocabulary for rendering flight. The Anzu bird, a divine creature that appears in several texts, is specifically described as having wings that create terrible windstorms when it flies. The noise is overwhelming. The wind knocks people down. This sounds like description of aircraft, loud engines, downdraft, physical force from aerial vehicle. But it's described as bird because birds fly, and ancient people had no concept of mechanical flight. The description uses available terms to depict something outside normal experience. If some Anunnaki possessed flight capability and others didn't, perhaps rank-based, perhaps function-based, the artistic depictions would show exactly what we see. Some divine figures with wings, others without, wings as distinctive attribute indicating specific subgroup. The rod and ring, held by Shamash in his role as justice god, held by Enki, held by Ishtar, granted to kings during coronation, signifying legitimate authority. What are these objects? Scholarly consensus, symbols. Rod represents measuring tool, ring represents perfection or completeness. Together they symbolize just rule, proper measurement, fair judgment, but artistically they're depicted as physical objects, not abstract symbols floating in air, objects held, objects granted, objects received. If they're symbolic, why the physical emphasis? Alternative, they're actual objects, technological devices, authority tokens, communication tools, something granted to kings and judges to signify or enable legitimate power. The rod's length and ring's shape might be diagnostic of function, something activated by combination of linear element and circular element. We're deep in speculation now. But the point is, every iconographic element can be read as symbol or as description. Our default is symbol because we assume mythology. But if we suspend that assumption temporarily, descriptive readings become possible. Composite creatures. Mesopotamian art includes beings that mix attributes, human body with bull head, lion body with wings and human face, fish body with human torso. These are clearly mythological, right? Perhaps. Or perhaps they describe genetic engineering, cybernetic enhancement, or simply exaggerated depiction of beings wearing animal masks and costumes. The text describes some of these creatures, particularly the Abkalu, the seven sages, as Abgalmes, which the word means great ones of the waters. They're depicted as fish-garbed humans, human bodies wearing fish cloaks that cover the head and extend down the back, like cape. This doesn't require fantasy biology, it describes costume, special garments identifying a class of teacher priests. The fish garment might have functioned like academic robes, indicating status, learning, authority, but artists sometimes depicted the Apkallu as actual fishmen, fish head on human body. This could be artistic shorthand, becomes identity in visual layer or misunderstanding across time to artists not realizing it was costume, depicting it as biology. The point, even composite creatures, which seem most obviously mythological, can have alternate explanations if we allow for documentation distorted by time, artistic convention, and limitation of visual vocabulary. We're not insisting on these alternate readings, we're demonstrating that Mesopotamian iconography doesn't prove mythology any more than it proves documentation. The attributes are consistent, which suggests importance. Whether that importance is symbolic or descriptive remains open question. But here's what the consistency does prove. Mesopotamian civilization maintained detailed identification system for divine figures over thousands of years. Every artist knew how to depict Enki, Shamash, Ishtar, Ningirsu. Every viewer could identify. This matters because it demonstrates shared cultural knowledge. Not vague the gods exist, but specific this god looks like this, that god looks like that. Precision. detail, consistency. You see this level of precision in documentation, police sketches, wanted posters, portrait galleries, identification cards. You see it when identifying specific individuals matters. Did Mesopotamian culture need to identify gods because they believed in them strongly? Yes. But also, did they identify gods because gods or godlike beings were observed, recorded and remembered with enough specificity that attributes became standardized? The art doesn't answer this, but it preserves the standardization. And when we combine that standardized visual record with the standardized textual record, names, roles, genealogies, actions, all remarkably consistent, we face a civilization that treated the Anunnaki as objectively real as they treated their kings. Whether that reality was theological or historical, symbolic or physical, imagined or remembered, the evidence shows Mesopotamian civilization functioned as if the Anunnaki were real, documented, identifiable, and persistently present across their cultural memory. And if we take that documentation seriously, not as proof, but as testimony worth examining, we face a provocative possibility. What if the Sumerians weren't creating mythology? What if they were keeping records? The alternative reading. Everything we've examined can be interpreted two ways. The art can be religious symbolism or visual documentation. The text can be mythology or historical record. The consistency can result from conservative theology or from preserving information. Both interpretations fit the evidence. Neither is provable. But let's explore what changes if we provisionally accept the alternative reading. The Sumerians were documenting encounters with non-human intelligence they called the Anunnaki. Not proving it, exploring it. First, the timeline becomes significant. Sumerian civilization appears abruptly around 3500 BC with sophisticated technology, complex social organization, and writing. Mainstream archaeology infers a longer developmental period that simply hasn't been found. Alternative reading, the abruptness is real because the civilization received technological infusion from outside source, the Anunnaki. The Sumerian king list records this claim directly. It states kingship was lowered from heaven, meaning granted or transmitted from non-human source. The antediluvian kings rule for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years in some versions. Mainstream interpretation, symbolic numbers, mythological time. Alternative interpretation, either the beings weren't human and had different lifespans, or the numbers record something else counts, dynastic successions, computational units we don't understand. The flood appears in the king list, then the flood swept over. After the flood, the reigns become shorter, more human-scaled. Post-flood kings ruled decades, not millennia. This suggests transition. Before the flood, non-human or enhanced human rulers. After the flood, normal human rulers. This matches the Atrahasis epic and the flood account in Gilgamesh, where the flood is sent by the gods to reduce human population. After the flood, the gods withdraw somewhat. They're less directly involved, more distant. Humans continue with civilization the gods established, but without the same level of direct oversight. The alternative reading sees this as describing actual events. Phase 1, Anunnaki present, directly governing, establishing systems. Phase 2, Anunnaki less present, humans running systems with occasional guidance. Phase 3, by later Prilly, Anunnaki mostly absent, humans maintaining civilization through inherited knowledge. Second, the technology transfer claims become literal. The Me Enki possessed weren't abstract principles, but actual knowledge, possibly recorded in physical formats, siblets, devices, teaching systems. When Inanna steals the Me and brings them to Uruk, she's transferring technological knowledge, relocating centre of innovation. The Apkallu, the 7 sages who predated the flood, weren't mythological figures but actual teachers, possibly Anunnaki themselves or human students of the Anunnaki who established the foundations of civilization in 7 different locations or taught 7 different knowledge domains. Berossus recorded their names: Oannes or Uan, Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalana, Anenlilda, Utuabzu, and Enmedurana. He specified that ONS taught in Eridu, the first city, before the flood. The precision of names and locations suggests preservation of information, not invention. Third, the creation accounts take on different significance. Enuma Elish describes humans created from blood of sacrificed god mixed with clay. Atrahasis describes humans fashioned by Enki, and the birth goddess from clay mixed with God's flesh and blood. Symbolic reading: humans are mixture of divine and earthly, spirit and matter, elevated beyond animals by divine spark. Alternative reading: humans were genetically modified, existing hominid stock, earthly biological material, enhanced with genetic material from Anunnaki divine blood, their Dina or biological essence. The result: modern humans, capable of language, abstract thought, civilization, capabilities that appear abruptly in the archaeological record with no clear evolutionary precursor at the sophistication level. The texts say humans were created to work for the gods, to farm, build, maintain irrigation, provide food and resources. This has always been read as humans serving gods through religious obligation. Alternative reading: humans were created as labour force for actual physical tasks the Anunnaki needed done. The temple economy, where citizens provided labour and goods to temples, preserved this original arrangement. Fourth, divine human interactions become contact events. Gudea dreams, contact through altered consciousness, communication of technical information, guidance for construction. The various theophanies, where gods appear to individuals, physical encounters with beings humans recognized as gods because of their attributes, size, radiance, knowledge, technology. The intermarriage between sons of gods and daughters of men, mentioned briefly in the Sumerian texts and more extensively in biblical texts, Genesis 6, genetic mixing between Anunnaki and humans, creating hybrid lineages that became royal dynasties. The concept of divine kingship, kings descended from gods, preserves this claim. Certain bloodlines contain Anunnaki genetic heritage. Gilgamesh described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, possible hybrid, explaining his extraordinary abilities, size and lifespan. When the text describes him as taller and stronger than normal men, it might document actual biological differences in hybrid lineages. Fifth, the astronomical knowledge becomes significant. The Sumerians had sophisticated astronomical observations. They knew planetary periods, tracked eclipses, identified constellations, understood precession, the 26,000-year cycle of Earth's axial wobble, supposedly not discovered until Greek astronomer Hipparchus in 2nd century BC, yet possibly known to earlier cultures. Their mathematical system used base 60, which we still use for time and angles. Why base 60? Mainstream answer: convenient for division, having many factors. Alternative consideration: inherited system from more advanced culture that had specific reason for that base, perhaps matching natural cycles, perhaps compatible with their own physiology or timekeeping. The calendar system, with its 12-month year and periodic adjustment mechanisms, demonstrates understanding of Earth's orbit and solar year. Did they develop this through centuries of observation, or was it taught to them by beings who understood celestial mechanics from broader perspective? Sixth, the architectural achievements raise questions. Ziggurats, massive step platforms reaching towards sky, each level painted different colour, representing different celestial realm or planetary level. They served as temples, but their structure suggests something else too. Platforms for observation, communication, possibly landing or launching. The Sumerian word for ziggurat relates to reaching upward or building high. The Tower of Babel story in Genesis, which describes humanity trying to build tower, reaching heaven and being stopped by gods, might preserve memory of actual architectural projects, where humans attempted to replicate Anunnaki technology or reach Anunnaki realm and were prevented. The precision of temple construction, with astronomical alignments accurate to small fractions of degrees, demonstrates either remarkable mathematical skill or access to advanced surveying tools. Some temples incorporate acoustic features, chambers with enhanced resonance, channels that amplify or direct sound in specific ways. Accident, clever engineering, or incorporation of principles taught by more advanced culture. Seventh, the disappearance narrative explains later history. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, texts describe the gods as more distant, less responsive, harder to contact. The literature takes on nostalgic tone, remembering when gods walked among humans, when divine human contact was common. This shift could reflect changing theology, moving from immanent gods to transcendent deity. Or it could describe actual withdrawal, Anunnaki leaving, reducing their presence, allowing humanity to develop independently after providing foundation. The memory aspect becomes crucial in this reading. Humans remember the contact, preserve the knowledge, maintain the systems, but gradually lose understanding of origins. Early texts preserve clear information, specific names, specific events, specific technology. Later texts show degradation. Information becomes more symbolic, more mythologized, more distorted by time. By the time we reach the 1st millennium BC, much is already lost. Scribes copy old texts without fully understanding them. Rituals are performed because tradition demands it, but original purpose is forgotten. The Anunnaki become theoretical beings, theology rather than memory. Eighth, the global parallels suggest something widespread. The alternative reading doesn't claim Sumerians alone had contact. It notes that cultures worldwide have similar claims. Gods from sky teaching civilization, golden age when gods walked earth, flood that destroyed that age, humanity continuing with inherited knowledge. Egyptian texts describe the Neteru establishing kingship. Hindu Vedas describe the Devas interacting with humans, teaching, fighting, interbreeding. Mesoamerican traditions describe Quetzalcoatl and other gods bringing civilization. Greek traditions describe titans and Olympians involved in human affairs. Chinese legends describe the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, superhuman rulers who taught civilization. Either every ancient culture independently invented similar mythology, or they're all preserving different cultural memories of similar events. Contact with non-human intelligence during a specific period of human prehistory, that intelligence establishing the foundations of civilization then, withdrawing. This is the alternative reading in its fullest form, not claiming proof, presenting pattern. Does it work? Does it make sense of the evidence better than conventional mythology interpretation? It explains some things more easily. The abrupt appearance of sophisticated civilization, the technical precision in texts, the consistent preservation of names and attributes across millennia, the parallel claims across cultures, the specific claim of technology transfer. But it requires accepting extraordinary premise. Non-human intelligence visited Earth, modified human genetics or culture or both, established civilizations, and left. That premise contradicts current scientific consensus about human development, which sees civilization as emergent property of biological and cultural evolution, not as externally introduced. The extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. Does Mesopotamian art and text provide that evidence? No. It provides evidence compatible with the claim, but also compatible with conventional mythology interpretation. The art can be symbolic, the texts can be mythological, the consistency can be conservative theology. We can't prove the alternative reading from the evidence we've examined, but we can say this: the Sumerians themselves claimed it, repeatedly, consistently, across thousands of years of written record. They said the Anunnaki came from elsewhere, established civilization, taught humanity, ruled directly, then withdrew. We've dismissed that claim for 150 years of modern scholarship on grounds that it's impossible, that gods don't exist, that ancient people were scientifically primitive and couldn't have understood what they experienced even if something unusual happened. But what if we've been too quick to dismiss? What if we took their claim at face value, not as proven fact, but as testimony worth serious investigation? That doesn't mean accepting ancient astronaut theories uncritically. It means examining evidence more carefully, looking for anomalies mainstream frameworks don't address, keeping minds open to possibilities beyond current paradigms. Because the evidence does have anomalies, and mainstream scholarship acknowledges them, then explains them away with varying degrees of satisfaction. What mainstream overlooks? Mainstream Assyriology is sophisticated, rigorous, evidence-based discipline. Scholars spend careers mastering dead languages, analysing archaeological contexts, comparing texts, building historical frameworks. Their work is invaluable. Without it, we'd have no access to Mesopotamian civilization at all. But every interpretive framework has blind spots, things it can't easily explain, phenomena that don't fit comfortably, anomalies that get acknowledged, catalogued, then set aside as interesting but not paradigm threatening. Let's examine specific anomalies the mainstream acknowledges but doesn't satisfactorily explain. First, the sophistication appearing immediately. The very earliest Sumerian cities show urban planning, streets laid in grid patterns, drainage systems, dedicated quarters for different industries, monumental public architecture. This level of organisation supposedly develops over centuries of gradual urbanisation. Yet at Uruk, it appears in the archaeological record already formed. Mainstream explanation: earlier developmental period existed but hasn't been found yet. Sites are buried deeper, destroyed by flooding, eroded away. Future excavation will find gradual progression. Possibly true. But we've been excavating Mesopotamia for 150 years. We found thousands of sites. We have good coverage of the sequence. The progression from Ubaid villages, relatively simple agricultural communities, to Uruk city's Benti is abrupt in the archaeological record. The anomaly remains. Civilization appears more suddenly than evolutionary models predict. Second, the cuneiform development. Writing systems evolved from pictographs to phonetic signs over very long periods. Egyptian hieroglyphs took centuries to fully develop. Chinese characters evolved over millennia, but Sumerian cuneiform goes from earliest simple pictographs to fully functional writing system in about 200-300 years. That's extraordinarily fast. It suggests either intense selective pressure, immediate urgent need for complex writing, or external model being existing system rather than inventing from scratch. Mainstream acknowledges the speed is unusual, but attributes it to Mesopotamian trade networks requiring detailed record keeping, bureaucratic needs-driving innovation, cultural genius of Sumerian civilization. All plausible factors, but the speed remains anomalous, and the alternative, that writing was taught rather than invented, fits Sumerian claims about receiving the me from Enki. Third, the astronomical knowledge. Sumerian and later Babylonian astronomical texts demonstrate understanding that took modern science centuries to rediscover. They knew planetary periods with remarkable accuracy, they tracked Venus cycles, they predicted eclipses, they understood precession. How? Mainstream answer: careful observation over many generations, accumulated data, mathematical analysis. But some of their knowledge seems to predate the observation period needed to confirm it. The precession cycle takes 26,000 years. You need centuries of precise observation to detect it. Yet evidence suggests various ancient cultures knew about it far earlier than observation periods should allow. Did they observe longer than we think? Is human civilization older than we recognize? Or was the knowledge transmitted from culture with longer observation period or more advanced understanding? Fourth, the specific numbers and measurements. Temple dimensions, architectural ratios, astronomical constants appearing in texts show sophisticated mathematical relationships. The ziggurat stages correspond to planetary distances according to some analysis. The temple ground plans incorporate pi, golden ratio, and other mathematical constants. Mainstream, coincidence, or Mesopotamians recognized these ratios aesthetically/intuitively and incorporated them without understanding the mathematics, but the precision and consistency suggest deliberate incorporation. If these ratios were taught as sacred proportions, build according to these specifications, the consistency makes sense. If they're cultural preferences, why the mathematical precision? Fifth, the genetic claims. Texts state humans were created by mixing divine blood/flesh with earthly clay. Mainstream reads this as creation mythology, explaining human nature as blend of spirit and matter, but the description uses surprisingly biological language. The text specifies birth goddess mixes materials, forms bodies, carries them through gestation period, births them in batches. It reads less like God speaking cosmos into existence and more like laboratory protocol for biological engineering. Modern genetic engineering involves taking existing organism, modifying genetic code, growing modified organism to maturity. If ancient texts describing this process existed, they'd probably sound remarkably similar to Atrahasis' account, taking existing material, earthly biological lock, adding new element, growing result through biological process, producing modified organism. We're not claiming Atrahasis describes genetic engineering. We're noting the language is compatible with that interpretation, in addition to mythological interpretation. Sixth, the flood accounts. Flood mythology appears globally, not just Mesopotamia. Mainstream explanation: floods are common disasters, so cultures develop flood mythology, possibly based on real regional flooding events. But some flood accounts contain suspiciously specific details. The Atrahasis flood is sent deliberately by gods to reduce human population, which had grown noisy and disturbing divine rest. One god, Enki, warns his favourite human, Atrahasis, and gives detailed instructions for building ark, specific dimensions, materials, waterproofing techniques, what to bring aboard. After the flood, the gods regret their action. They're starving because humans aren't providing offerings anymore. They need humans. When Atrahasis emerges and makes offering, gods gather like flies around the sacrifice, grateful for food. This doesn't sound like symbolic universal flood. It sounds like specific historical event described from perspective that gods were physical beings who depended on human civilization for something. If the flood was real historical event, catastrophic sea level rise at end of last ice age, impact event, some disaster that destroyed widespread coastal civilizations, then preserving account of that disaster would make sense. The divine involvement might be added explanation, or might preserve information about who warned certain groups, allowing them to prepare and survive. We know from archaeology that many ancient cities were abandoned suddenly. We know sea levels rose dramatically as Ice Age ended. We know impact events happen. A major disaster in deep prehistory is geologically plausible. The anomaly, flood accounts are too consistent, too specific, and too widespread to be easily dismissed as independent invention of similar mythology. Seventh, the linguistic complexity. Sumerian is grammatically sophisticated from our earliest texts. It's agglutinative language, like Turkish or Japanese, building complex meanings through combining morphemes. The grammar is fully developed in earliest texts, not showing evolution, just appearing already formed. Languages evolve, they change, they simplify or complexify over time, but Sumerian seems relatively stable across the periods we can observe. It changes less than linguists would expect for time periods involved. Possible explanation: writing stabilizes language, makes it conservative. Also possible, Sumerian was already old when writing was invented, was literary language alongside other spoken language, though texts don't indicate clear diglossia. Or Sumerian was taught language, introduced whole, maintained carefully because it was inherited from Anunnaki as civilization's official language. That last suggestion sounds absurd, but it fits Sumerian claims and explains the anomalies. Languages don't usually appear fully formed. Sumerian did. Why? Eighth, the cultural conservatism. Mesopotamian religious texts, artistic conventions, divine names and ritual practices remained remarkably stable across over 2 millennia. Despite political upheaval, invasions, new ruling dynasties, language changes, Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic, the core religious content persisted. This could indicate religious importance, keeping traditions alive. Or it could indicate the traditions were maintained because they recorded information considered too important to lose. Information about origins, about the Anunnaki, about how civilization was established. Cultures that believe their traditions are mythological or symbolic feel free to modify them. Cultures that believe their traditions are historical tend to preserve them more carefully. Mesopotamian culture's conservatism suggests they treated these accounts as historical, not metaphorical. Ninth, the technological vocabulary. Texts sometimes describe divine objects or weapons using terms scholars can't fully translate because the references are unclear. The Anzu bird steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, a physical object that somehow conveys authority over cosmos. What is it? Mainstream, symbolic object representing divine sovereignty. Alternative, device that controlled something real, communication system, computer, administrative tool. Ninurta wields the Shurur, a mace that talks, scouts, reports intelligence. Mainstream, personified weapon, literary device. Alternative, device with surveillance and communication capabilities, described as talking weapon because that's the closest available Sumerian vocabulary. The Anunnaki use the Mi, which are sometimes described as physical objects carried, transferred, possessed. Mainstream, abstract principles. Alternative, storage devices containing information, crystal matrices, metallic tablets, something that preserved knowledge physically. We can't know which interpretation is correct, but the linguistic ambiguity exists because the texts describe things outside normal Sumerian experience. When they describe familiar objects, pots, grain, sheep, temples, the language is clear. When they describe divine objects, the language becomes vague, metaphorical, confused. This pattern matches how people describe unfamiliar technology. Without vocabulary for it, they resort to analogy. It was like a chariot, but flying it was like a fire, but cold it was like a tablet, but glowing. The texts might preserve such descriptions. 10th, the absolute chronology problem. Mesopotamian king lists and astronomical observations allow reasonably precise dating of periods we can verify against other sources. But for earliest periods, the numbers become problematic. The antediluvian kings in Sumerian king list rule for tens of thousands of years total. Mainstream treats these as symbolic or corrupted numbers. Alternative, these numbers record something real but misunderstood, population counts, cumulative dynastic years, different timekeeping system, something that made sense in context but was preserved without proper interpretation key. Some researchers suggest the numbers use base 60 or other mathematical systems differently than we assume, and recalculating with different assumptions produces more reasonable timescales. Others suggest the numbers are purely symbolic, but the fact that specific numbers are preserved, not just long ago, but specific counts, suggests the numbers meant something. What they meant remains unsolved. These 10 anomalies don't disprove mainstream interpretations. Each has conventional explanation that works within current paradigm, but collectively they suggest Sumerian civilization contains genuine mysteries we haven't fully solved. Mainstream acknowledges the mysteries but doesn't pursue alternative frameworks because the current framework is productive, generates research, explains most evidence satisfactorily. But most evidence isn't all evidence. The anomalies persist. The alternative framework, that Sumerians documented contact with advanced non-human intelligence, would explain all 10 anomalies more parsimoniously than conventional explanations. But it requires accepting premise that current science rejects, that such contact occurred. This creates impasse. Evidence is ambiguous. Both interpretations fit. Choice between them depends on prior assumptions about what's possible. If you assume non-human intelligence didn't contact ancient humans, you interpret evidence as mythology, symbolism, primitive confusion, cultural genius, and occasional anomaly. If you allow that non-human intelligence might have contacted ancient humans, you interpret same evidence as documentation, preserved memory, technological descriptions, and consistent testimony. The evidence itself doesn't resolve the debate, but it keeps the question alive, because the Sumerians were not primitive. They were sophisticated, literate, mathematically advanced, astronomically knowledgeable. If they said the Anunnaki came from heaven and taught civilization, we should at least take seriously the possibility they meant what they said, not accept it uncritically, investigate it seriously. And the investigation remains open, because we're still finding Mesopotamian sites, still translating tablets, still analysing artefacts. The evidence keeps expanding. What we've examined tonight, the seals, the reliefs, the statues, the texts, represents fraction of available material. Thousands of tablets sit untranslated. Thousands more await excavation. Somewhere in that material might be clearer answers, or the question might remain forever open, evidence sufficient to wonder, but insufficient to know, which leaves us where every good investigation should leave us, with evidence examined, possibilities considered, judgment suspended, and mystery honoured. The question remains. The vault is quiet again. The seal of Ada rests in its climate-controlled drawer. The steel of the vultures stands against the Louvre wall. The Waka vase, survivor of looting and chaos, holds its place in Baghdad. Gudur's statues pray their eternal prayer. The Sumerian king list chronicles its impossible reigns. And the question remains, were the Sumerians mythology makers or record keepers? Were they imagining gods or documenting others? Were they inventing civilization's origin story or preserving memory of how it actually began? We've looked at evidence, physical objects you can visit in museums, examine in person, verify exists, translations from actual clay tablets with catalogue numbers and scholarly references, images carved by ancient hands showing scenes that, whether symbolic or documentary, were important enough to render permanent in stone. We've seen consistency, the Anunnaki appearing across texts with same names, same roles, same attributes, divine figures depicted in art matching textual descriptions, architectural achievements matching descriptions of divine instruction, astronomical knowledge matching claims of heavenly teaching. We've noted anomalies, civilization appearing abruptly, writing developing rapidly, knowledge exceeding expected accumulation period, claims too specific to be easily dismissed as fantasy. And we've acknowledged both interpretations work. Mythology reading and documentation reading both fit the evidence, neither proven, neither disproven. So where does that leave us? With intellectual humility, recognition that ancient people weren't stupid, weren't primitive, weren't confused children making up stories. They were humans like us, observant, thoughtful, capable of distinguishing reality from imagination. When they said the Anunnaki existed, they meant something by it. What exactly they meant, whether theological belief, metaphorical wisdom, or literal historical claim, remains debatable. But they meant something real to them, something foundational to their civilization, something worth preserving for millennia. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe the Anunnaki were imagined. Powerful imagination, consistent imagination, sophisticated imagination, but imagination nonetheless. Or maybe they were right. Maybe beings came, taught, built, departed. Maybe human civilization is younger than we think, but was catalyzed by something external. Maybe the gods were others, and others were physical, and physical means discoverable through evidence. If the latter is true, more evidence exists, somewhere, perhaps in untranslated tablets describing technologies we'd now recognize, perhaps in genetic markers showing manipulation events in human prehistory, perhaps in artifacts with properties that don't fit historical context, perhaps in patterns across ancient sites, alignments, constructions, knowledge distributions that suggest coordination beyond cultural diffusion. Researchers continue investigating. Not mainstream researchers usually. They have careers to protect, paradigms to honour, peer review to satisfy. But independent researchers, amateur archaeologists, open-minded scholars willing to risk reputation for truth, continue asking uncomfortable questions. Some find promising leads, some find nothing. Some find what they're looking for, regardless of whether it's there, a risk in any investigation driven by preconception. But the question itself is legitimate. Could ancient testimony about non-human intelligence be literally true rather than mythologically true? That question doesn't disrespect ancient cultures. It takes them seriously. It says, you claimed this happened, we've dismissed your claim for generations, but maybe we should reconsider. Reconsideration doesn't equal acceptance. It means genuinely examining evidence, admitting anomalies exist, acknowledging current paradigms don't explain everything perfectly, staying open to revision if new evidence emerges. Science works this way at its best. Observation, hypothesis, testing, revision. The hypothesis ancient gods were mythological is dominant paradigm. The hypothesis ancient gods were physical others is alternative framework. Both should be testable against evidence. Both should be held provisionally pending better data. Currently, mythology hypothesis has more academic support because it requires fewer extraordinary assumptions. It fits worldview where humans developed civilization through natural processes, where gods were cultural constructions, where nothing outside current scientific understanding was happening. The alternative hypothesis requires accepting advanced non-human intelligence existed and interacted with humans during civilization's founding period. That's extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence, which we don't have yet. We have evidence compatible with the claim, but not evidence proving it. So the question remains open. And that's acceptable. That's honest. That's where the evidence actually leaves us. Uncertain, wondering, investigating further. What should you do with this information? First, verify it. We've cited specific artifacts, specific museums, specific catalogue numbers. Look them up. Examine photographs. Read translations. Confirm the evidence exists as described. Don't accept our presentation uncritically. Second, read more. Primary sources when possible. Actual translations of texts like Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, Gilgamesh. See what Sumerians actually said, not filtered through modern interpretation. Resources exist online. Ixetrasol, electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, CDLI Neem Digital Library Initiative, museum databases with high-resolution images. Third, think critically. Hold both interpretations, mythology and documentation, simultaneously. See which explains specific evidence better. Notice where mainstream interpretation struggles. Notice where alternative interpretation speculates beyond evidence. Be honest about strengths and weaknesses of both frameworks. Fourth, stay curious. New discoveries happen constantly. Satellite archaeology finds new sites. Excavations produce new tablets. Technologies like ground-penetrating radar reveal structures without digging. AI assists with translation of difficult texts. The evidence base keeps expanding. Maybe future discoveries will definitively resolve the question. maybe they'll keep it open. But the investigation continues regardless of what we currently know or don't know. The Sumerians left testimony. They carved it in stone, pressed it in clay, preserved it through centuries of upheaval. That testimony says the Anunnaki were real, they came here, they built this civilization, they taught us what we know. We can dismiss that testimony as myth. That's been the default for generations of scholarship. Or we can hold it in suspension, not accepted, not rejected, but genuinely examined. If you're listening from somewhere quiet, the middle of night, the end of a long day, those liminal hours when big questions feel possible, take a moment to sit with the mystery, not to solve it, just to acknowledge it. Human civilization is either extraordinary accident, random combinations producing language, art, cities, science through purely natural processes, or it's something else, something with more intention behind it, something guided, taught, catalyzed. The evidence doesn't prove which, but it doesn't disprove either. And in that space of genuine uncertainty, that openness to possibilities beyond current paradigms, that willingness to take ancient testimony seriously, in that space, growth happens, understanding deepens, truth, whatever it ultimately is, becomes more approachable. The Seal of Adda shows Shamash rising between mountains, Enki with his waters, Ishtar with her weapons. They stand together in that carved space, present, interacting, identifiable. Were they imagined, or were they remembered? The question remains, and perhaps that's exactly where it should be, open, unresolved, inviting further investigation. The investigation belongs to all of us, not just to academics with degrees and institutional positions. To anyone willing to look at evidence, think carefully, question assumptions, stay open to mystery. Thank you for investigating with us tonight, for considering possibilities, for examining evidence, for letting the question be genuinely open rather than prematurely closed. If this resonated with you, if these questions matter to you, if you want to continue exploring, know that you're not alone. Others wonder the same things. Others look at the same artifacts and texts and feel that pull toward deeper truth. Keep wondering, keep investigating, keep your mind open and your standards of evidence high. The Anunnaki, whether gods or others, mythology or memory, remain one of humanity's deepest mysteries. And mysteries are precious. They remind us how much we don't know, how vast reality is, how much remains to be discovered. Rest well, dream deep. And if you dream of ancient cities, or beings descending, or stones carved with impossible knowledge, pay attention. Sometimes truth speaks in symbols before it speaks in facts. The mystery continues. The evidence waits. And somewhere, in vault and museum and unexcavated tell, more testimony lies waiting for someone willing to hear what it has to say.